coffee in hand, we're walking over to the desk, and as always, the most important aspect here is putting the coffee down without spilling it. We're here, we're safe. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, welcome to the world's squeakiest chair, and welcome to my desk. Today we're recording the third episode in the Tennessee Fats Library podcast series. And I know it's always strange, and it seems very strange even to me that I'm recording these in video, but that's the practice I got into. So that's why we're doing this. I'm going to record this in video, it's going to be uploaded to YouTube. The audio formats will then push off to the several vehicles that you guys might be listening to this out in the world through. So today we're actually doing a big one. So this video I think is probably going to go a little long. And I've got enough notes on this one that if you are watching the video, something you're going to notice is I'm looking down at my notes off to the side here a lot. Because, well, today we're doing our first novel. And how we got here is actually a really weird series of events. And it has nothing to do with anything but just me being a nerd. So, back in October 2023, Skybound Comics started to release the first in their series of Universal Monsters, I guess, comic adaptation stories. They're each mini-series, 4 issues, I believe, a pop. So far they've done Dracula, The Invisible Man, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Mummy, Frankenstein. Yeah, I think that's all of them. At least as of the recording of this podcast. And the first one was Dracula. And I'll tell you honestly, as a guy who really enjoys Universal Monsters, I like the whole franchise. I like everything that came out of that. It's just one of those things that clicks with me. And as a guy who also really enjoys Gothic horror, these things came out and they came right up my alley. And I was like, oh, this is exciting. And so the Dracula one came out, and that was the first one. And I was blown away. The writing and the art were married in such an amazing way, and you can clearly tell the company done such a fantastic job choosing two parties that can come together and build off of one another's strengths so much that it really shocked me. And I was shocked enough that I completely nerded out. Yeah, I did. I wrote a letter. I actually wrote a letter into the editor saying, you guys have done a fantastic job, clearly stating exactly what I just said. And I didn't really think anything was going to come of it. And subsequent issues of that Dracula series come out, and they published my letter. And they actually wrote back to me, which was fantastic. And they said, well, first of all, they wondered why I was Canadian and the name Tennessee Fats. I get that a lot. But the second thing was, well, if you really enjoy Gothic horror, you really want to read this book that we're going to cover today. And what really floored me was they directed that back at me. It was incredible to have an editor of a comic actually saying, no, you want to read this. And I was like, oh, okay. So I immediately went on the Amazon, tickety, and I ordered it. And it came into the Casa del Fats within very short order. And then I read the actual not dust jacket, but the write-up on the back. And I said, holy poop, this is way too scary for me. And I put it on the shelf, and I promptly forgot about it. Because I don't do horror well. It's funny, I like Gothic horror, I like that sort of genre, and I like the Universal Monsters, but horror as we observe and use it today, and I don't get along at all, actually. But I finally said, about a month ago, okay, it's time you got off your butt, and you actually read this thing, and you actually did do this. This was suggested specifically to you, so do it. And plus, I said, well, plus I've got this podcast thing that I'm doing, so this would be a good thing to cover. It could be the first full story. And that's how we got here. So without any further ado, what we're covering today is the novel Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Oh, let me pull up my actual physical copy here. Did I get that correctly? Yes, Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Now, this is a really cool one because everything that we've covered so far on the channel is old. And I know we're only on number 3, but even everything I've covered on my other channel, the main channel, the Tennessee Fats one, is all old stuff. Except for comics. Sometimes those are new stuff. But really when we're reading stuff that's like 100 and some odd years old. So it's really kind of neat to find something that's new. This book was actually published in June of 2020. And the print version that I have here is the 11th print edition, which I think came out in 2023 or something. But what I really like about this one is A, it's a floppy sort of paperback, and I have no problem dog-earing the corners and folding over what I think is important. B, I can write all over it because I don't care. And C, in the back, the publisher has included all sorts of really cool stuff. And some of the cool stuff that's back here really leads into what we're doing on this podcast. What we do on this podcast, what we do on the channel, is we're diving into stories that I've read, and we're walking through what happens in them. And then we're diving into themes, and then we're discussing the content within them, and we're talking about maybe archaic terms or how these themes are prevalent today. And this is what we're actually hitting when we hit these books. It's a labor of love for me. That's why we're doing this. What they've done here, though, is they've included a whole bunch of stuff in the back of the book that actually supports and helps you do that. In fact, a lot of the stuff they've included here are part of, I'm going to read this right off the back, the Random House Book Club. They have pertinent questions to ask. Okay, you just read the story. What do you think of this? What do you think of this? All open-ended questions. Nothing could just be answered with a yes or a no. They're all things that make you think. And it's a really cool thing that adds to it. In addition to that, what they've also done is they've thrown in interviews with the author. They've thrown in a snippet of what her next story is going to be. It's really cool stuff. I think this was a cool thing for us to pull in, and honestly, administratively, it made this whole thing a lot easier. We're not going to read through all the questions that are in the back of this. If you do want to read through those book club questions, then maybe you want to contact somebody else that's actually part of the Random House Book Club and do that. But they definitely helped when I was going through the stuff we're doing today. What we're going to be doing today is walking through the stuff that we normally do. We're going to go through 4 different sections in this video. And I'm going to warn you guys now. Spoiler alerts are going out right now. I walk through the content. Okay? If you don't want to know what happens in this story, stop. Or somehow track ahead to the end if you just want to get to the themes and my advice as to whether you want to buy this for a friend or not. Because we are going to go through in the first segment of this exactly what happens in this story. Our first segment always is what happens, who was in the story, and really what are the events that turn through this. And within that, I'll tell you, today what we're going to do is we're going to spend a fair amount of time reading quotes from the book in the front end of the story. But then something's going to happen, or we're going to switch more into just summary and action near the second half of the story. And you'll find out why when we get there. The next chapter that we generally do in these, and we're going to cover today, is what are the themes that jumped out at me? And what are the ones that really hit me and maybe go, oh, wow, that's really cool. Themes are always a fun thing. And sometimes when we're looking at the really old stuff, we have to ask, are these still applicable today? And sometimes when we're looking at the new stuff, well, we don't really need to ask that question because obviously they're still there. Then we'll do a piece where we talk about the archaic language. Now, archaic language in this one wasn't so much these are old terms that we've lost. Archaic language in this one actually was, well, what are some of the terms that are specific to Mexico in 1950 that I don't know? I got to tell you, as an old guy living in Canada, limited exposure to Mexico other than when I travel there, a lot of these terms were completely lost on me and I had to walk through them. So we're going to walk through those for you guys. So if you're reading through this and you're wondering, well, what the heck is that? Well, you're going to find out. Finally, we'll go through my thoughts on the story. What did I think of this? Should you buy this? And the other part of that is, what are some ancillary readings or suggested readings that can come out of this? How does this relate to something we've already covered? In fact, this one actually does relate to something we've already covered, and I had no idea it did until I finished reading it. But the good part about it is, because of those segments in the back of the book that are included in this 11th edition, the author actually gives you suggestions for further readings, but in a very subtle way because of the way one question's asked of her. It's really cool stuff. Final point of administration. Last one of these Tennessee Fats library podcast things that we did was the first one where I published in one spot and it successively pushed out to 4 different platforms. And that's the iHeartRadio, the Spotify, Amazon Music, and what's the other one? Apple? Yeah, Apple. So it did that. So this one, if everything works out well, will be the next one doing that very thing, which allows you to listen to this offline when you're at a treadmill or doing laundry or whatever. Why would you want to sit and watch me do this on the YouTube channel? Don't do that. Just listen to the audio if you're interested in it. Yeah, there you go. That's what we're going to be covering today. Without any further ado, I guess let's just jump into the first. One final thing. And I will say this. If you are watching this video, be prepared. A lot of this video is going to involve me looking down at a giant bundle of notes over here on the lappity-toppity because there's just too much for me to try to remember here in one take. So be aware. There's a reason why eye contact is not going to the camera continuously throughout the whole thing. Now, I think it's a good last piece of administration. Okay, let's get into part 1. What is this Mexican Gothic? Okay, so what is Mexican Gothic? I guess we'll try to summarize this in a couple ways. And bear in mind, as we're going through this, I'm going to give you the quick summary, and then we're going to look down at the notes, and we're going to start reading through really what happened in here in detail. And that's when we're going to start getting through the quotes. So, 2-line summary on this one. The story is really one about a city girl who was sent off on a mission by her father to check in on her cousin who recently married and moved away. When she gets there, she finds out that the house that her cousin's living in is haunted. Or is it? And she needs to overcome and defeat the machinations of the family patriarch and escape back to Mexico City. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. But there's a lot going on here. This is where we really need to start diving into this because that's way too flippant and way too brief. The story is also one where you have a twist in the middle of this one, where the beginning of the story is really one where you have a lot of time spent theme and tone setting. And it's only when really the actions occur, and I mean actions occur, that suddenly the story shifts more into a mechanical, this happened, that happened, this happened sort of story. Prior to that, you're getting a lot of tone, and then suddenly it becomes this runaway rickshaw story where you're trying to get to the end of it because all these things are happening. There's just so much on the go, and it really does make for an incredible read. So let's walk through this. Okay, so the story starts with our protagonist, Naomi. I think I'm saying her name correctly. Neomi. Naomi, yeah. And she's been summoned home from a house party where she's at, well, basically just living her socialist life with her boyfriend, Hugo. She's been summoned home by her father. And really in these opening chapters, you get a clear sense that Naomi is a socialite, in the purest sense of the word. She comes from a well-to-do family. Her father is very much the patriarch of that family, and you get a very clear sense that what he says goes. You also get a very clear sense that she's somewhat, I don't know, it's a word that occurs a couple times throughout the story, and it's flighty. And I don't know how it actually applies. Well, hold on, I'm gonna stop myself on that one, because you'll see more of that when we get near the end of the story, and you really don't see any flighty tendencies coming out at that point in time. Maybe this is sort of a growth model for her. Anyways, she's been summoned home, this socialite, drawn out of this party. And she's convinced that she's been summoned home because her father does not approve of Hugo. Because Hugo's, well, he's a bit of a dip. Well, he's not really a bit of a dip. He's just a junior guy in his... Listen, it's moot point. Set that detail aside. She's been summoned home. She's somewhat irked about it. Her father is sitting in his lounge, not in his lounge, his office, and is saying, okay, we need to have a conversation. And she's completely taken off guard by what she's actually confronted with. Where she thought she'd have to be defending her actions with Hugo, she's now actually being confronted with something else. Her cousin Catalina recently married Virgil Doyle. Now, we're just like first names here as we go through this one, because it starts to get rather complex. I'll let you know when there's a difference in last names, when it's purposeful and there's a meaning for it. So she married off to Virgil through really just a very quick marriage, and then just disappeared. And you really get a sense as well that the father was not quite approving of this marriage. You also get a sense in this initial chapter that really the father viewed the marriage on behalf of the groom as being one where there's trying to get access to Catalina's money. Because again, Naomi's family has money. Money is actually a pretty major theme in this one. We'll see that as we move along here. But what's happened is as Catalina's moved away, she's also become ill. And they've been writing, because I guess phones aren't a thing. Well, it's 1950. Phones are a thing. Well, maybe phones weren't really a thing out. Maybe they weren't out in the burbs in Mexico. I don't know. I didn't live in Mexico in the 1950s. I don't know. Anyway, so they're writing, and it's come to the father's attention that she's ill. But what's happened along the way is that Catalina's also written a letter. And the letters come to the father, and this letter is just downright chaotic. And I'm going to read this one for you here. This is going to be our first chapter where we get into the reading here. And Naomi, I'll give you the actual preface as how... Preface. Let's go with preface as to how we actually get into this. Naomi had a hard time reading the words, much less making sense of the sentences. The handwriting seemed unsteady and sloppy. And this is where we get to the italicized, where the actual letter is. He's trying to poison me. That's a fairly material opening to a letter. The house is sick with rot, stinks of decay, brims with every single evil and cruel sentiment. I've tried to hold on to my wits, to keep this foulness away, but I cannot, and I find myself losing track of time and thoughts. Please, please. They are cruel and unkind, and they will not let me go. I bar my door, but still they come. They whisper at night, and I am so afraid of these restless dead, these ghosts, fleshless things. Ooh, yeah, okay, that's written pretty quick into setting the tone. The snake eating its tail, the foul ground beneath our feet, the false faces and false tongues, the web upon which the spider walks among the very strings vibrate. I am Catalina Taboada. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. Catalina. Cata, come out and play. I miss Naomi. I pray I'll see you again. You must come for me, Naomi. You have to save me. I cannot save myself as much as I wish to. I am bound. Threads like iron through my mind and my skins, and it's there. in the walls. It does not release its hold on me, so I must ask for you to spring me free. Cut it from me. Stop them now. For God's sake. ... Hurry, Catalina. Okay. Yeah. I don't know. If I receive that letter, I could see being concerned. I think the first sentence really just, okay. He's trying to poison me. Yeah, that says something. That's the thing. Okay, so as concerned as Naomi's father has been, he kind of takes the softer approach, I guess, when he's writing back to Virgil after receiving this, and he suggests that Catalina should be coming home. Home in this case being Mexico City, where she was raised, back to her family. And he suggests that possibly she should be coming back to seek professional help, which Naomi's father at this point in time has assumed means mental health related. And Virgil's fighting this and saying it's not necessary. Now, we get a little more tidbit of how the family dynamic works here, and this is kind of an important thing, because we see Naomi negotiating with her father here about this, because she's saying, well, why would I do this? Number one, how could you trust me with this? Number two, and the father really pushing down hard, and we get a couple character traits from Naomi spelled out very clearly here. The father is dictating that she's flighty, that she changes her interests frequently. Inference could be made here that perhaps she's changing her interests in her suitors, and maybe that's something that's coming up as well. And that's a theme that you'll see Virgil play on later in the story, although we'll try to steer clear of as much of that as possible. Anyways, but we now find out that Naomi is interested in going and continuing university and transferring out of her college, which is fairly specific and safe and sedate and designed in 1950 for women, and wanted to go to the General University to study anthropology and get a master's with that. And this is where the father suggests, okay, listen, you go do this, and I will approve of your application into the other university to do this. And that's really the hook that the father used to draw Naomi into this. Now, it's kind of funny. You would wonder why the father would go through and make this choice. But I guess it's kind of spelled out in the letter that came from Catalina. Catalina says that she misses Naomi and please come and rescue her. So I guess that kind of says one thing. Another aspect of this really has to do with the society bias that exists at the time. And I'm saying this because you really do see this theme. The father is very much concerned about a divorce and the scandal that will cause the family. You also get some tidbits of background information about Catalina. You find out that she hasn't had an easy life, that both of her parents died when she was young. You also find out that she had a suitor that she was in love with, that the father, Naomi's father, Catalina's uncle, chased off at the time. And this is why Catalina's been staying with them and living with them, because, well, both of her parents are dead. And the father's really been taking on a position of trying to parent her. And you really do get a sense that this is not an easy. You also have the tone here put in that perhaps the father relented and let Catalina marry Virgil because he felt bad about chasing off the first suitor. But either way, Naomi's now hooked on this. She's like, oh, if I'm going to get my master's in anthropology and this is all it takes, I'm in, let's go. Again, odd. But set that aside. She then starts off on the process of getting there. Now, bear in mind, this story takes place in 1950 in Mexico. She's leaving her socialite life in Mexico City, which I'm imagining was probably somewhat glamorous. And now she's heading out into the burbs, out into rural Mexico. And this is where and the place is called, what's it called? El Triunfo. Triunfo? Yeah. And she's going to the Doyle family estate, which is up in the mountains. Now, the author really does something here that dives into the tone setting. And this is something that we're going to be hitting hard at the beginning of this video, is we do spend a lot of time talking about tone, because that's really what this is. It's very much a tone-setting story, much like Edgar Allan Poe did, much like a lot of other people did that are writing in this space. It's all about creating the mood. So as she moves further away from Mexico City, things are changing. This is where we're going to start going through some of the quotes here as we start reading through what we're seeing. All right, quote number 1. The higher the train moved and the closer it got to El Triunfo, though, the more the bucolic landscape changed, and Naomi reassessed her idea of it. Deep ravines cut the land, and rugged ridges loomed outside the window. What had been charming rivulets turned into strong gushing rivers, which spelled doom should anyone be dragged by their currents. At the bottom of the mountains, farmers tended groves of fields of alfalfa, but there were no such crops here. just the goats climbing up and down the rocks. The land kept its riches in the dark, sprouting no trees with fruit. The air grew thin as the train struggled up the mountain until it sputtered and stopped. The train station was not busy and was barely a station at all, just a lonely square-shaped building with a half-asleep woman behind a ticket counter. 3 little boys were chasing one another around the station playing tag, and she offered them some coins if they helped her lug her suitcases outside. They did, gladly. They looked underfed, and she wondered how the town's inhabitants got by. Now the mine was closed, and only the goats provided the opportunity for a bit of commerce. Really setting the tone here is, okay, maybe we're going to rather a poor area. Naomi was prepared for the chill of the mountain. The unexpected element was therefore the thin fog that greeted her that afternoon. Ooh, fog. Classic Gothic theme. She looked at it curiously as she adjusted her teal calotte hat with the long yellow feather and peered into the street looking for her ride, for there could hardly be any mistaking it. It was a single automobile parked in front of the station, a preposterously large vehicle that made her think of swanky silent film stars of 2 or 3 decades earlier, the kind of automobile her father would have driven in his youth to flaunt his wealth. But the vehicle in front of her was dated, dirty, and needed a paint job. Therefore, it was not truly the kind of automobile a movie star would drive these days, but seemed to be a relic that had been haphazardly dusted off and dragged out onto the street. That's a rather terse assessment. And as she gets in the car and heads off, and she's now driving away from the station towards the actual Doyle family estate, the trees grew closer together. It was dark under their branches. She was not one for nature, not the real thing. The last time she had been anywhere near a forest had been in that excursion to El Desierto de los Leones, when they were riding and her brother and her friends decided to do some practice shooting with a tin can. That had been 2, maybe even 3 years before. This place did not compare to that. It was a lot wilder here. She found herself warily assessing the height of the trees and the depths of the ravines. Both were considerable. The mist thickened, making her wince, fearing they'd wind up halfway down a mountain if they took the wrong turn. How many eager miners hunting for silver had fallen off this cliff? The mountains offered mineral riches, but a quick death. But Francis seemed secure in his driving, and his words faltered. Francis sort of lightens the mood a little bit here. But still, this place is getting harsh. It's a lot different than what she's used to. And they get to the house. Then all of a sudden they were there, emerging into a clearing, and the house seemed to leap out of the mist and greet them with eager arms. It was so odd. That's it. It was so odd. That's the sentence. Okay. It looked absolutely Victorian in construction with its broken shingles, elaborate ornamentation, and dirty bay windows. She'd never seen anything like it in real life. It was terribly different from her family's modern house, the apartments of her friends, and the colonial houses with facades of red tizonto. I think it was stone. The house loomed over them like a great, quiet gargoyle. A gargoyle, okay. It might have been foreboding, evoking images of ghosts and haunted places, if it had not seemed so tired. Slats missing from a couple of the shutters, the ebony porch groaning as they made their way up to the steps of the door, and which came complete with a silver knocker shaped like a fist dangling from a circle. Oh, okay. Yeah, you really do get a sense that this place is just getting darker and gloomier as she goes. It actually gets worse and worse as she approaches this odd house. Now, along the way to the house, Francis and Naomi get a good chance to chat. And they chat a little bit about, well, who Francis is. And we find out that Francis is Virgil's younger cousin. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of family tree information at this point in time, because it kind of helps when you're going through the story to know who these people are. So Virgil being Catalina's husband. Virgil's father is Howard. Howard is the family patriarch that I mentioned earlier when I did that brief synopsis. Howard had a brother whose name was Leland. Leland is no longer with us. Leland was married and had a daughter named Florence. So Florence is the first cousin of Virgil. Florence then had a child named Francis. Francis is the individual who just picked up Naomi at the train station. So he's a cousin of Virgil's, but once removed is how he calls it, because he's one generation down from his first or direct cousin. So that's really what you've got here. Now, I'll tell you this as well, and you know this now. Virgil's mother's no longer in the picture. She's gone. Leland and his wife are gone. And that's kind of the information that we need to know for now. The rest is going to kind of fumble its way through as we get there. Yeah, let's go with that. So anyways, when they arrive at the house, Naomi is immediately greeted by Francis, his mother, Florence. And Florence we find out right off the bat, is not somebody to be messed with. It's interesting because Florence is really set up, and you'll see her become more and more of this as the story continues on. Almost like this staunch picture of conservative Anglo values. And I'm going to call it that. I'm using the term Anglo values here because you need to understand Naomi is not coming from that place. Naomi is coming from a Latin American value system. And this is a staunch English house that's been picked up and transplanted into Mexico. And we see more of that as the story goes along. But Florence is really kind of like the household matriarch that's just holding all these ridiculous rules in place. And it's funny because right off the bat, she immediately jumps into rules. Just like, this is what we do here, and these are the rules, and these are the 2 rules that we have. Here, I'm going to read you one. Hold on here, friend. Let's just jump into that right now. I got to read E, which is on page. Here we go. Where are we at here? Okay, I run High Place, and therefore, if you need anything, you need to come to me. We do things a certain way around here, and we expect you to follow the rules. What are the rules? Most important rule is that we are quiet and private lot, Florence was saying. My uncle, Mr. Howard Doyle, Howard being the patriarch, is very old and spends most of his time in his room. You are not to bother him. Second of all, I'm in charge of nursing your cousin. She's to get plenty of rest, so you must not bother her unnecessarily either. Do not wander away from the house on its own. It's easy to get lost in the region. It is puckered with ravines. Anything else? We do not go to town often. If you have business there, you can ask, and I'll have Charles drive you. Then later shows her to her room. This is your room, she said, and Florence once they reached the door with a decorative crystal knob. I should warn you that there is no smoking in the house in case you participate in that particular vice, she added, eyeing Naomi's chic handbag as if she could see through it and into it a pack of cigarettes. And it's like, right off the bat, like, no, these are the rules. You're silent. We don't make any noise. Don't bother Howard. Oh, I take care of your cousin. You can't bother her unnecessarily. And at this point in time, Naomi doesn't even know what the heck is going on with her cousin, what the diagnosis is. And right off the bat, it's just, no, this is just what we do. It just sets a tone. And this is going to be a conflict that we're going to see between these two, basically, throughout the rest of the story, which works. So I guess it's a good thing. So another thing that Florence really lays down at this point in time, though, was that point that she manages the health of Catalina and that she's not to be disturbed. And she actually does kind of come out right off the bat and say, no, you're not going to see her today. Even though Naomi says, well, can I see her today? I did just travel all of this way to see her. And Florence's initial reaction is no. Now, interesting and subtle dynamic that pops up right now is that Frances then turns around and says, come on. And it's interesting because if she's really the major role player in the house, i.e. the person who sets the rules, you see Frances here, after a brief conversation with Naomi, no real connection between the two of them whatsoever, starting to question that very thing. And I'm not saying that he said, come on, really. I mean, that's just me paraphrasing. But it really was one of, come on. She came all the way, really? Come on. So Florence does relent and does allow Naomi to see Catalina. And this interesting meeting with Catalina right off the bat is one where you go, what? Because it's all about the subtleties. And it's all about the subtlety. Here, I'm going to read for this how this actually goes. Okay, hold on. So she's been led into the room. And she's actually been left alone with Catalina, which is kind of interesting. See why later. Catalina, it's me, Naomi. She placed a hand gently on her cousin's shoulder, and only then did Catalina look at Naomi, and she smiled slowly. Naomi, you've come. She stood in front of Catalina, nodding. Yes, Father has sent me to check up on you. How are you feeling? What's wrong? I feel awful. I have a fever, Naomi. I'm sick with tuberculosis. But I'm feeling better. I'm sorry, tuberculosis? Okay. I did not see that coming. That's the thing. Okay. You wrote us a letter, do you remember? It said odd things in it. I don't quite remember everything I wrote, Catalina said. I had such a high temperature. Catalina was 5 years older than Naomi. Not a great age gap, but enough that when they were children, Catalina had taken on the motherly role. Naomi remembered many an afternoon spent with Catalina making crafts, cutting dresses for paper dolls, going to see the movies, listening to her spin fairy tales. It felt strange to see her like this, listless, dependent on others, when they had all once been dependent upon her. She did not like it at all. It made Father awfully nervous, Naomi said. I'm so sorry, darling. I shouldn't have written. You probably had many things to do in this city, your friends, your classes, and now you're here because I scribbled nonsense on a piece of paper. Don't worry about it. I wanted to come and see you. We hadn't seen each other in ages. I had thought that you would have come to visit us by now, to be frank. Here's where the first bomb comes out. Yes, Catalina said. Yes, I thought so too, but it's impossible to get out of this house. Catalina was pensive. Her eyes, hazel pools of stagnant water, grew duller, and her mouth opened as if she were ready to speak, except she did not. She drew her breath in instead, held it there, and then turned her head and coughed. Catalina, it's time for your medicine, Florence said, marching into the room with a glass bottle and spoon in hand. Come now, and promptly ended the meeting. Okay, what do you mean you can't leave the house? Now, she did allude to that within the letter, right? So maybe this is something that's more than just a, mental health thing. I'm starting to get these little snippets, perhaps. So after this really weird interaction with Catalina, Naomi is promptly escorted back to her room, where she's left until 7 p.m. Now, you don't really have a sense of exactly what time of day it was when she arrived there, but you do get a sense that some time passed. Now, also along the way, let's start throwing out some points about the house that are observed here. It's a dump. It is a dump in the classical term of the dump. It is a full de-ump. What you're looking at here is there's sparse electricity throughout the place. They had electricity run into it, but it just doesn't work. Most of the lamps in the wall sconces are off. So most people walk around at night carrying oil lanterns. The windows are all barred, as in they don't open. So when she's in her room, it doesn't open. Other things that start to be noticed right off the bat is she's like, there's mold everywhere. This place smells moldy. It's fungusy moldy. You can't smoke here. I can't open my window. It's cold. Hot water is at a premium. All these things are here while Naomi is stuck in her room until 7 p.m. when she's summoned for dinner. This is really getting into this old school society type thing. So I can understand why we're piecing this together and placing this in the 1950s. Or actually exactly in 1950, because you're really trying to draw in and showing almost a societal shift from this very old school British turn of the century noise to something much more lively, loud, out there and, interactive. So things are changing slowly. Anyways, she's left in there to think about Catalina now. Now, while she's there, and this is something that you're left wondering for a good chunk of the story. Bear in mind, you're reading a story that's called Mexican Gothic. So there's something here that's going to be horror-based. And Catalina's dropped some bombs here. First was in her letter, and now she said she can't leave the house. And then when she was pressed for more, she was going to say more, but then she just stopped, and then magically somebody walked through the door. So that's kind of creepy, right? But you're left wondering, is this some sort of paranoia and schizophrenia that she's going through? Or something like that? Or is this actually something metaphysical? And at this point, we don't know. You're reading a book called Mexican Gothic. You kind of get a sense for it. But as the reader, ignoring the outside noise of you're aware you're reading a book called Mexican Gothic, you don't know. So, okay. 7 o'clock, she's summoned. She's taken down to eat the food. The food is crap. It's just typical, bland, old English noise. And she's not that much interested. And while she's there, though, she meets the family. So in the family, she discovers that she's meeting with Florence, who she already met. There are servants serving the food. There's Francis, who she's already met. There's Virgil, who I believe she mentioned she had seen when he was in Mexico, but it was sort of a whirlwind thing, and then he was gone. And you do meet Howard, the patriarch. And Howard, right off the bat, starts off just diving into racist dialogue and eugenics. It's funny because he's an old fart, like really old. You get a sense when he's there that he is beyond old. He's literally falling apart. But he starts off by just saying, "Oh, you're a lot darker than your cousin," and she's like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." And then we jump into the eugenics conversation. Now hold on here, I'm going to jump her into this. So right off the bat, where she made the comment about where are we here? You're much darker than your cousin. So there you go. Merely an observation. Now tell me, do you believe, as Mr. Vasconcelos, I guess is how I'd pronounce that, does that it's the obligation, no, the destiny of the people of Mexico to forge a new race that encompasses all races, a new cosmic race, a bronze race. This despite the research of Davenport and Stegerda. You mean their work in Jamaica? Splendid. Catalina was correct. You do have an interest in anthropology. Yes, she said. She did not wish to share more than that single word. What are your thoughts on the intermingling of superior and inferior types, he asked, ignoring her discomfort. And this goes on. And it's interesting because you're really diving into now conversations about eugenics. Now, bear in mind, Howard is old. I've already mentioned he's older than dirt. But he's well read up on things that are relatively recent, at least as far as 1950s standards goes. And he's diving right into authors that he's well aware of, that Naomi is actively studying. So clearly his brain isn't gone, even though his body might not be. It's a funny thing that he just dives right into that. It's one of those ones that makes you go, Why are we going down this road? But that does set another clear tone that we see coming up time and time again in this story. So after this really weird exchange, Howard goes off to bed because, well, he's old. As I mentioned, he's old. And it leaves Virgil and Naomi sitting in the sitting room because Virgil now wants to have a conversation with Naomi to find out what the heck is going on here. Now, I can kind of see where Virgil's coming from here. And this is at this early stage, let's just bear in mind his optics. So he's married Catalina. Catalina's moved in with his family. Catalina's become sick. At least that's the surface story that we've run into. And now this interloper has shown up, invited herself to his estate. She's staying with him, and she's asking all sorts of questions about his wife. Now, I can understand Naomi's point of view. I can understand the father's point of view. Bear in mind, Virgil doesn't know about this letter that was sent by Catalina directly back where they mentioned the poisoning thing. So yeah, I could see where his concern is. And suddenly you have Naomi coming out hard saying, well, what is she sick with? What's going on? Who is the doctors? What's happening here? And Virgil's kind of taken aback. Well, hold on. We're not all backwater hicks here. Come on, we've got a doctor. Our family doctor comes in once a week, deals with my father. That's why he's here regularly, and he's dealing with Catalina. And if you want to talk to him, he's going to be here probably within a day. You can talk to him. But again, really pushing back and saying, setting a tone quite clearly that he's not happy that Naomi is here. And I think that's kind of warranted, given his position a little. So, yeah, I could see that. And she's just summarily sent off to her room, and that's the end of the conversation. Now, the next day she's meandering the house a little bit more, because she has time on her hands. She's completely alone. Nobody comes to visit her. She's just there. I guess bear in mind that she's kind of seen as an intruder in this house, so maybe they don't feel obliged to come and visit her. Yeah, I can see that. And she's meandering around. She goes into the library, finds a whole bunch of books on eugenics. And the other things that she discovers while she's there are that all these books are moldy, which is strange. She's studying eugenics now, or moving into anthropology now, and that's what she's talking about at university. But these books are old and they're getting moldy. That's weird, right? Anyways, clearly a state of disrepair. And as she wanders around further, she meets the servants. And as she talks to the servants, they don't respond to any verbal cue whatsoever. Now, again, you could see this as them really being just cold shouldering her, or just sort of ignoring her. But it's odd. It is odd. But she does run into Francis. Francis, bear in mind, is the individual picked her up at the station. Francis is the one that stood up to Florence right off the bat and said, come on. Francis suggests, well, maybe you want to see more of the house other than just inside because it's dull here. Let's go check out the coach house, the English cemetery, and see what's going on. So they meander about. They go to the cemetery, and Naomi notices something strange. The majority of the tombstones all say 1888. And this is where we start to really get a sense of what some of the prior issues are within the house. And this is where the threads start getting dropped. So Francis lets it be known that, after the Mexican War of Independence, that the mine sat in disrepair for a long time. Nobody thought there was any value in it. But Howard, who's the patriarch, came over and said, no, there's totally silver here. We should mine this. Brings over English machinery, brings over English workers, and they start working the mines. But a couple years after the mine opens is when there was an epidemic, and all the workers died. All the English workers died, and they were buried there. And that's what Francis says, and they were buried here. And Catalina says, well, did they have to get more English workers when those died? And Francis says, no, we had plenty enough Mexican workers by that point in time. And, English person running it, they all flooded here. It made sense. So when they died, some of them are buried here, but the rest are buried down in the village, those who had family in the village. And this is where it's kind of interesting because you get more of a sense of really where the Doyles were. They're currently really down in their luck. This was 1888 when this first epidemic happened, right? So it gives you a sense of also age. That's how long Howard's been here. This story takes place in 1950. Okay? And this mine hasn't been running for a little bit of time. What's going on in here? And what is the level of importance to this whole epidemic thing? And it's kind of an interesting thing. This is dropped now, but it's not really picked back up. It's just left there to simmer that, there was an epidemic. Oh, okay. Then she ends up approaching the Doyle family crypt. And there's this weird phrase in Latin, and I want to make sure I get this right here. Okay, so it's et verbum cere, I believe it's pronounced cere in Latin, factum est, which means, and the word becomes flesh. Okay, and that's over top of the family crypt, which is kind of a thing. And there's also a statue, and we find out that the statue in the cemetery is of an individual named Agnes Doyle, who we later find out was Howard's wife. Now, you kind of wonder, okay, well, this is Howard's wife, and there's a Virgil. So you as the reader are kind of sitting here going, well, I guess that's Virgil's mother. And underneath it is a little plaque, and it says mother. So you're like, okay, all right. You also get a sense of the actual ages involved here, because it's 1950. Virgil was born in 1915, but you were also told that in 1915 was when the mine shut down and when it got flooded, because it all sort of happened around that point in time. So that means that this place has not been producing now for 35 years. So the Doyles are really living on borrowed money at this point in time, or borrowing their own money at this point in time. At some point in time, that money's going to run out. We also find out that Francis is actually 10 years younger than Virgil, born in 1925, and that it's kind of intoned. You really get a sense he doesn't like Virgil that much. He was the only person around when he was a kid, but really not that much of a nice guy. Anyways, that's kind of what you get out of the whole cemetery debacle, where they have a whole conversation. Nothing bad happens, but you start to get some theme and background information on the family. So after the whole cemetery initial information session, where you start to see there's some not so good things happening with the Doyle family, Naomi heads back to her room. Now, she's in her room because there's nothing else for her to do. And while she's there, she's trying to read a book that she brought with her, and it's a witchcraft book that she constantly tries to go back and forth to try to pick up something and just have something to flum through and basically waste time. But this is where she notices something, and this something is kind of important, and it kind of sets a major tone here, and it's going to become more of a tone later. But it's where we start to see these subtle little drops. This is why I'm reading this one first, okay? In the corner of her room, there was a bit of mold upon the wallpaper that caught her eye. She thought of those green wallpapers so beloved by the Victorians that contained arsenic, the so-called Paris and Shell greens. Now bear in mind, she knows this because her father, I guess, works in dyes. So she learned something about the science of dyes and colors, basically from that. That was set out in, I guess, the first chapter. And wasn't there something in a book she'd read once about how microscopic fungi could act upon the dyes in the paper to form arsine gas, sickening the people in the room? So arsenic. Yeah, that's not good. That's not good at all, actually. That's actually a really bad thing. But it's just one of those things that she mentions, and then she just sort of goes, whatever, and then moves off, and that's just the end of that particular point. But that's a subtle point that's set here for a reason. I'm going to leave it at that. The next day she wanders off, and she does have access to Catalina. And she's talking to Catalina, and Catalina says, hey, listen, I need you to go into the village. I need you to meet with a young lady named Marta Duval. And she's going to get some medicine for me. She made it for me before just to explain what it is, but you can't tell anybody that you're getting me this medicine. Can you do this for me? And Naomi's like, well, yeah, I guess so, and wants to ask questions. And Catalina shuts her down right off the bat and says, no. We can't discuss this any further because they'll hear them. Now, they're the only two people in the room. And this is where Catalina drops a bit of a bomb. Now, here's the actual sentence, because she's saying, well, who is? The walls speak to me. They tell me secrets. Don't listen to them. Press your hand against your ears and remember, they're ghosts. They're real. You'll see them eventually. Yeah. And then, this is how this conversation ends. Abruptly, Catalina releases her cousin and stood up, gripping the curtain in her right hand and staring out the window. Naomi wanted to ask her to explain herself, but Florence walked in on them. Dr. Cummins has arrived. Conversation continues on. The walls are listening? The walls are listening. So, okay. This is one of those classic things where you as the reader now are going, okay, is Catalina legit going crazy? Is this paranoia to that point where the walls are listening? It kind of does leave you wondering. So that quote ends with the doctor arriving, and this is really the opportunity that Naomi's been waiting for. She wanted to talk to the family doctor, and Virgil said she could. So, Virgil, the doctor, and Naomi have a conversation. This isn't really a conversation, though. What comes out of this is really the doctor almost dictating rote answers specifically to Naomi. No, she has tuberculosis. Yes, people react this way to the medicine. No, this isn't an issue, and you shouldn't even be questioning me. And the doctor's getting irked that he is getting questioned. And particularly he's getting irked that he's getting questioned by this young lady who clearly doesn't know anything about medicine in his mind, but he's just dismissing and dismissing. And Virgil's just sitting here behind the doctor saying, no, you wanted to talk to the doctor. That's the doctor's answer. What more do you want from me? And this is one where you start to say as the reader, okay, hold on. Granted, it could be that Catalina is going completely crazy. Because really, the walls are listening sort of thing is kind of like right out there. But these people are acting really, really suspicious. And this is starting to run through Naomi's mind as well, because you can see in the writing that she's starting to question, like, why are you giving me these predetermined answers without even hearing my questions? And this is where things go a little weird. This is where suddenly Virgil decides to pull the line of let's blame the victim and points out, well, she was suicidal before. She was really depressive after her parents died. Now, bear in mind, Virgil wasn't there when her parents died. This is stuff that's just coming out of nowhere. And Naomi's like, no, I was there when her parents died. You weren't. And I don't remember any of this. And it leaves you as the reader going, what is going on here? Naomi, at this point in time, just pushes back hard. No, I want a second opinion. And Virgil finally relents after a bunch of arguing and says, okay, yes, fine. You have my permission to go and get a second opinion. Not really where that second opinion is going to come from, but you have my permission to go and get it. And that's really where the conversation ends, and you really have Naomi heading back to her room that night and just saying, okay, well, small victory for me here, but what's going to come next? Okay, well, I'll tell you what happens next. What happens next is Naomi goes back to her room, and she has a horrible dream. And it's funny because it doesn't start off as a horrible dream, but it rapidly turns into one. And this dream is something that, again, sets the tone. And note, I'm going to point to this very particularly because of some certain imagery that pops up in this. And it actually speaks back to something I've already hit upon. She has a horrible dream where she's sleeping in her room and suddenly the walls start sprouting mushrooms. And then when she touches the mushrooms, they explode into spores, and the spores get all over her, in her, and everywhere, and she can't get away from them. And it's at this point in time she notices that there's a figure of a woman that's also in the dream in her room. And this figure of a woman, you can see the body, but the face is just this glowing face, a light she can't really make out. And she's not really scared at that point in time. It's more of just one of these things, you're having a dream, you're observing the events. But it's when this particular individual starts to attempt to speak and nothing comes out, that Naomi now starts to get really scared. And a phrase pops up, which is open your eyes. And it's interesting because she knows that this phrase isn't coming from this individual screaming at her, but she does wake up to find herself back in her room. Kind of an interesting one because she hasn't had nightmares yet, and now this has occurred, and you're immediately jumping into mushrooms. Now this could be because she did notice when she was looking at the wallpaper earlier, hey, I see mushrooms, or a fungus here. Maybe it's the wallpaper making people sick. Arsenic, you never know. I have a bit of a knowledge about this. But that's a pretty scary dream. So the next day, Naomi does make her way into the village. Francis drives her in and leaves her alone because, well, she's there to meet a second opinion doctor. That's what the family has expected. That's what they've said. She's also there because she wants to buy smokes. And I believe the other thing that she's doing here is she's fulfilling this mission that Catalina gave her, which was to go meet Marta and get her some medicine. So right off the bat, she does find the village doctor. Now, it's interesting. The village doctor is a younger doctor. And it's referred to here repeatedly that Doyle's kind of dismiss him because they say he's so young. And it's funny, they almost compare him to her age. But that can't possibly be true because how could he already be a village doctor if he was her age? That's kind of weird. But I think that's more of a dismissive comment that they're throwing in just to try to make this guy go away. So the doctor, when he finds out who she is and where she's come from, is like, whoa, 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 whoa. Dr. Cummins deals with the Doyles. They don't want me up there. They've never wanted our assistance in the village. They just do their thing and we do our thing. And Naomi is pushing hard, saying, no, seriously, I need a second opinion. And this is where the doctor says, well, what does Dr. Cummins think it is? And she goes, well, tuberculosis. And the doctor, it's the village doctor, is like, what? Tuberculosis? Here? Nah, it's crazy talk. What are you talking about? He's never heard of tuberculosis in the area before, which is why a diagnosis of this is, well, really odd. And it doesn't ring true to him, which also sets up a little bit of an alarm on Naomi's head where she's like, well, hold on. Well, if it's not tuberculosis, then what is it? And they start having conversations now about the Doyles, and the doctor is somewhat tight-lipped, but he is willing to talk a little bit. And this also gives Naomi a chance to start to see what the villagers think of the Doyles and what the perception is from the locals of who these English folks are that live up in the mountains. And it's kind of interesting. The first thing they talk about is the epidemic. Now, there's some particularly important point here that comes in the doctor's description of what happened with the epidemic. And it's kind of funny, actually, because Naomi's asking, well, what were the sort of symptoms that came with the epidemic? And this is where we get the feedback. The doctor tapped his pencil eraser against the desk 3 times. It wasn't clear. It had a high fever and it was very tricky. People would say the oddest things. Catalina's kind of saying the oddest things. They'd rant and rave. Catalina's kind of ranting and raving. They'd have convulsions. Okay, we haven't seen that from Catalina yet. And then they'd attack each other. We haven't seen that yet either. People would get sick, they'd die. Then all would be well. And then a few years later, again, the mystery illness would strike. Well, hold on. We only heard about one epidemic when we were in the cemetery talking about that. And now we're hearing about this recurring every couple of years? That's kind of weird. And it's kind of funny because this is where the doctor kind of alludes to the fact that, when they were really sick, that they actually had mass graves and all sorts of noise around that, which really does once again set the tone for what the villagers think of the Doyles. But he does agree that he will go up and actually check on Catalina because Naomi's really pushing hard for him to do this. And it's funny because this is at 1950. And for some reason, this doctor just kind of accepted that these people would get a fever, they'd rant and rave, say crazy things, attack one another, and then die. And then a couple years later, it would just come back. And that this was just going to be an accepted thing of, well, that's just what the epidemic was. It's kind of weird. But also the point that, the Doyles just tossed them into a pit. Well, that really does once again set the tone for, well, who are these people? And there's a pit? And again, Naomi did not see a pit when she was in the cemetery, so that seems kind of strange. It also doesn't match what Francis said earlier. So finishing Naomi's conversation with the doctor, she then wanders off to fulfill the next mission that she had, which was to meet Marta and try to get some medicine for Catalina. Again, this is being done on the down low. The Doyles are not allowed to know about this. She does end up finding Marta because the doctor actually told her where she was. The doctor knows of Marta, and she's a healer in the village, and why not? They would know one another. So Naomi wanders over, explains to Marta who she is, and Marta does say, yeah, I know Catalina. Didn't know her name. But yeah, I know her. We gave her some medicine, and she asked me to mail a letter for her. And I told her that the medicine would work a little bit, but not a lot, because, that family is cursed. And Naomi was like, what? And this is where Marta goes, a little bit of mercenary action. She says, well, I can tell you a story, what's going to cost you. And she's getting paid off in cigarettes, which is kind of funny. I don't know why. Well, I know why, and I'll leave that to you. If you really want to know, go and dive into the story, and you'll see what she does with the smokes. But anyway, she says the family is cursed because you don't know the story about Ruth. And then we get an interesting vignette here. So Ruth was the daughter of Howard. Okay, so this would be then a Virgil sibling. So I'm assuming Virgil first sister. That's what we'll leave it with for now. And how one day she just went off her rocker, shot Howard, shot her mother. Howard obviously survived because we've seen Howard. Shot her mother, who I'm assuming is, or at least at this point in time, I'm assuming is that Agnes statue that we saw in the cemetery. We don't know who that is yet, though. Also shot her fiance, Michael. Michael, we find out, was also her cousin. You remember I said how Howard had a brother named Leland? And how Florence was the daughter of that brother. Well, apparently Michael was her brother and was also the fiance of Ruth. Yeah. Anyways, killed her mother. Howard survived. Killed her aunt and uncle, which would have been Leland and Leland's wife. Actually, I have her name written down right here. What was it? Dorothy. Shot Dorothy. And Marta also makes the point of she would have shot Virgil too if Florence hadn't hidden the baby. And suddenly you get the sense of, well, that sounds pretty darn violent. And then, bear in mind, this happens right after you've had the description of what the conditions and the symptoms of that epidemic were. So very violent actions, and you're like, ooh. Marta then goes on to describe how later on, years later, how Florence had showed up one day at the train station after these people never came down from the mountain and just went off on vacation, then came home married to a fellow named Richard. And how Richard was a nice enough fellow who would come into the village from time to time and like to talk to people. But over time, he started to look more haggard, started to look more tired, and started talking about really crazy things like ghosts and spirits and the walls talking, and how he started fading away as a person and really became quite slight. Now, this Richard individual is the father of Francis. Now, the reason why we don't see Richard anywhere is because Richard jumped into a ravine and died. Ooh, yeah. So there's no more Richard. So I'm starting to see how Marta and the villagers might see this family as being a little bit accursed. You've got these epidemics happening. One of their daughters goes crazy and shoots a bunch of them. And now Catalina's up there, recently married in, and she's died. This Richard guy came, recently married in. He's dead. I could see this. But there's a term that's actually used in an interesting quote here. And this is an interesting one that Marta makes. And I'm going to go into this one here. So it says, let's see. It all sounds tragic, but I'm not sure I'd call it a curse. That was Naomi speaking. Oh, you'd call it a coincidence, wouldn't you? Yes, I suppose you would, but the fact is that everything they touch rots. Oh, I like that word. Rots. The word suddenly sounded ugly. It seemed to stick to the tongue. It made Naomi want to bite her nails, even though she'd never done such a thing. Oh, she was particular about her hands. Ugly nails wouldn't have done well for her. It was odd. That house, the Doyles, and the servants were an odd lot. But a curse? No. But the rots word. I like that. That was well played out. Definitely set some tone. So that night, Naomi makes her way back to the house, and, well, she really thinks she's done a successful thing here. I mean, at the end of the day, she did manage to get a doctor, and she managed to talk to Marta, and medicine's going to be prepared, and she'll pick it up in some time. So, everything seems to be going in the right directions. And she's summoned back to the evening table for dinner. It's not being brought to her room, and everybody's going to have a big conversation. And it's funny because at this point in time, you really see a butting heads at the table, and it's just one of these things where you're like, are you guys kidding me? And it really is this point where you start to get more of a sense of Naomi really not fitting into the roles and rules that are set in the Doyle's house. And really she's getting, well, flack because she wants to talk while they're having their meal as opposed to remaining silent. She's catching flack for smoking in her room. Granted, it's their house, they don't want smoking, but they're really just attacking the actual vice itself. And why are they so sensitive to smoking? This is the 1950s. People smoke like chimneys back then. It doesn't make any sense. It's just kind of odd. Anyways, dinner ends and they're all summoned up to Howard's sitting room where they're going to have a conversation because Howard now wants to talk to Naomi again. And this conversation gets a lot of weird. And we really start to see more of the tone of how these Doyles might just be a little stranger than we initially thought. So when they get up there, there's a couple things that come up. A, you have a little bit of a more, I guess we'll call it a eugenics conversation, which is just kind of stupid. But B, you get an image of more about the Doyle's history. Within Howard's sitting room are two large painted pictures, one that's dated 1885 and the other one's dated 1895. And when Naomi's looking at them, she can tell these are siblings. They're related. You can see the common features. The first one is of Agnes. Agnes is Howard's first wife. And Howard explains this is who she was. And, this is my first wife. And she died during childbirth. And then you get, and that's Alice, her sister, who's my second wife. Oh, and by the way, they were my cousins. So we already had a bit of this come up when we heard about Ruth and how Ruth was engaged to Michael. Michael being her cousin under Leland. Leland being the father, who's no longer with us. And Ruth going, a little crazy and killing everybody. Well, not everybody. Almost everybody. Now you've got this actually going back a generation. And you hear the fact that Howard married his cousin Agnes. And then when Agnes died during childbirth, shortly after they arrived in Mexico, he then married Alice. Now, there's a 10-year gap there, though. You can clearly see the delta here. He married Agnes in 1885 and then married Alice in 1895. But this now makes you step back and go, well, hold on. Why is there a statue of Agnes out in the cemetery that says mother on it? And there's not one of Alice. And why is Agnes mother when Alice is actually the mother of Ruth and Virgil? It just seems strange. And it's interesting because Naomi, during this whole conversation, actually says to Howard, so you married your cousin twice? And Howard sort of pushes back and says, what, do you think that's kind of weird? And Naomi is just trying to exit this conversation, really just wants nothing to do with it. And she just shuts it down. It's like, yeah, no, it's not weird at all. No, everything's fine. And that was just a weird aspect of the Doyles that we're exposed to here. More of this idea of them marrying within the family. After the whole weird, I guess we'll call it a vignette. Yes, after this weird vignette into the history of the Doyle family, Naomi then goes off to her room and has her second dream within the Doyle house. And this is where we start to see these dreams becoming more of a norm. This one, however, is starting to go more into, a sexual direction. And this sexual direction takes more time and more hold within these dreams and even within her conversations later. But we'll deal with that then. This one is a fairly tame one by comparison, where she's lying in her bed and she finds that her blankets have been pulled off because Howard, just disgusting old man Howard, has meandered into her room while she's paralyzed, pulled the blankets off, unbuttoned her nightgown, and is now leering over her in a naked manner. And she can't move. She finds this really gross, but she can't move. And she hears that voice again, open your eyes. And she opens her eyes to find that, well, she's fine. The bed's been tossed around a little bit. The blankets are off. But everything's done up and she's totally okay. But this is the beginning of where we start to see more sexual tones coming into this theme that's coming through the story. Well, after the horrifying dream, Naomi's waiting for the doctor to arrive the next day, first thing in the morning. And she really wants to make sure she's one of the first people to greet the doctor, knowing what the doctor talked about, that he's probably not going to have the best of receptions in the Doyle house. She does meet him and does take the doctor into Catalina's room. And it's interesting that while she's there, Catalina really starts off cold and somewhat confrontational with the doctor, leading off into a place where she doesn't want to answer the doctor's question, doesn't understand why the doctor is there, says I'm fine, really is downplaying everything that's happened. But then she starts to get into a little bit of a lead away, a segue, where it's kind of like she's now starting to let things loose. I'll read for the whole discourse, because it's quite interesting here. There's no remedy, she mentions, because that's something that she mentions. She said something else, but it wasn't a real word. She babbled like a small child. Then Catalina suddenly clutched her neck as if she'd choke herself, but her grip was lax. No, it was not choking. It was more of a defensive measure, a woman guarding herself, holding her hand up in defense. The movement startled them both being the doctor and Naomi. Julio, who's the name of the doctor, also dropped his pencil. Catalina resembled one of the deer in the mountains, ready to dart to safety, and neither knew what to say. What is it? Julio asked after a minute had gone by. It's the noise, Catalina said, and she slowly slid her hands up her neck and pressed them against her mouth. Julio looked up at Naomi, who was sitting next to him. What noise? Naomi asked. I don't want you here. I'm very tired, Catalina said, and she gripped her hands together and placed them on her lap, closing her eyes as if to shut her visitors away. I really don't know why you must keep bothering me when I should be sleeping. If you will, the doctor asked. I can't talk anymore. I'm exhausted, Catalina said. And you're really getting a sense here that this is escalating. She's not handling this well. Her hands trembling as she attempted to clutch them together. It's really quite exhausting being ill, and even worse when people say you shouldn't do anything. It's really odd. Really, I'm tired. She paused as if to catch her breath. All of a sudden, Catalina opened her eyes very wide, and her face had a terrifying intensity to it. And there was the visage of a woman possessed. There are people on the walls, Catalina said. There are people and there are voices. I see them sometimes, the people on the walls. They're dead. She extended her hands and Naomi gripped them, helplessly trying to comfort her. And Catalina shook her head and let out a half sob. It lives in the cemetery. In the cemetery, Naomi. You must look in the cemetery. Then just as suddenly, Catalina stood up and went to the window, clutching the drape with her right hand and looking outside. Her face softened as if a tornado had struck and spun away. Naomi didn't know what to do, and the doctor appeared equally baffled. I'm sorry, Catalina said evenly. I don't know what I say. I'm sorry. What? Yeah, that was weird. It's a really strange thing for Catalina to be doing because, well, two things have come out of this. One was she was being purposely cold, like she was trying to make the doctor go away. And you'd say, okay, well, that seems somewhat sane as compared to her normal conversations. But then you get into the whole conversation about people and dead things in the wall and that she sees them. And then she shuts down suddenly. And it's interesting because after that whole exchange, the doctor and Naomi are both promptly rushed out of the room by Florence, who tells her, and it's interesting because Naomi is sitting here saying, well, she clearly needs mental help. But everybody's kind of, again, continuing to dismiss this. The doctor leaves and Virgil arrives and takes Naomi out to the greenhouse, which is something that Howard had mentioned the day before, because they do have a greenhouse on the site. And while they're there, Virgil and Naomi have an argument about Catalina and going to Mexico City to seek mental help. And at the end of the day, in Naomi's eyes, this all sounds like something psychological going on with Catalina, and I can see her point of view. Virgil, on the other hand, is not seeing this at all and is continuing to escalate. And while they're escalating, at some point in time during this, Naomi notices that while Virgil's having a bit of a, let's just say, a strenuous statement come out of him, that there's a glint of gold in his eyes that was never there before, and promptly that glint of gold just fades away. It was an interesting exchange, but again, you see Naomi and Virgil really almost starting to do this dance where Virgil's attempting to draw her in almost a seductive way, but at the same time attempting to push her back and say, no, you need to respect me. This is my wife we're talking about here. This is my house, and quite frankly put, you're an intruder. It's a strange dynamic that continues to get danced around. And that's really how the day ends. Now the next day Naomi says, I think it's time to go check out the cemetery. And check out the cemetery she does. She meanders off into the cemetery the next day because, well, there's obviously something here. At least Catalina continues to infer that there is something here. So, let's go check it out. And she wanders off into the cemetery alone. And this chapter goes actually in a rather interesting way. You see her surrounded by fog, and the fog is thick enough that she can't really recognize what's around her. And she thinks she's actually lost her way. Suspense is slowly building up throughout this chapter, as she also thinks she sees something in the distance, but she can't tell who or what it is. And it's at this point in time that kind of the world around you then becomes a threat for Naomi. And she starts to recognize, wandering around in a cemetery in the fog by myself in a mountain where there's mountain lions, probably not a good idea. And as she's dealing with the stress around this and discovering, I don't know where I am, she bumps into Francis. And this is interesting because really Francis is here and starts to become more and more of an ally or a shoulder to lean on for Naomi, which becomes tested at times, but this is sort of the point when it begins. They have a long conversation where she's partially teasing Francis because she knows she needs to draw him in and make him an ally. And at the same time, she's trying to get information out of Francis. Francis, on his own, is also trying to get information out of her and trying to understand more about her. It's interesting that in this conversation, he points out that really it's the family's opinion that she kind of needs a chaperone, which is the role that Francis is kind of filling in. And she begrudgingly sort of asks him, well, what are you doing out here anyways? And he's like, well, I'm collecting mushrooms. And she wants to make fun of him because you're collecting mushrooms in a cemetery? That's gross. He's like, no, I'm collecting mushrooms from over there. I'm walking through a cemetery. And then he says how much he actually enjoys studying botany and fungus and sort of stuff. And really they should look at some of the prints that they have. And they should probably do that the next day in the library when they have a chance. And the chapter promptly comes to an end as they head back to the house. Nothing really of consequence happens in here. It's just something that happens that was discussed that leaves you with a, okay. Well, the evening comes and goes in a rather uneventful way, and the next morning Naomi wakes up and she's discovered that she's not having her breakfast delivered to her by the maids or by Florence, but this time it's actually being delivered by Francis. She finds out that today Howard is ill, and everybody in the house is busy as they're trying to deal with Howard being ill. He's having a bad day. But Naomi remembers, hey, wait a minute, weren't we going to go to the library and check out this whole spore thing that we were talking about? Now remember, the library is that very place that she was at before where they have all these books on eugenics and everything's moldy. It's a place. And they do go. And they have quite a long conversation there where they're talking about these things, the very spores, looking at prints. And they're talking about the cemetery. And they're talking also about the fact that she wants to go into town the next day. And Francis says, well, that's okay, but you need to understand the family's kind of decided that you need a chaperone and I should be, following you to find out what you're up to. But it's okay because, we've sort of built this rapport now. What I'll do is I'll just drop you off and it'll be fine. Again, it's all sort of inferred subtly, but you do have a sense of that's what's occurring here. Unfortunately, as they're in the middle of this, Florence pops up and says, listen, we're all busy. What are you doing here? And starts to draw Francis away. Naomi does want to help. And she says, well, listen, if you're all busy, give me something that I can do and I can help out. Bear in mind, she's probably bored out of her skull at this point in time. So she gets assigned to basically polish all the silver that's in the dining room. And she goes through and she recognizes how old some of it is and how much of it there is. And she's also envisioning parties that they may have had when things are going well, but at the same time she's also kind of chuckling with a party at the Doyle house? Really? That's something that actually happened? She finishes the work, Florence comes back and begrudgingly has to acknowledge that it's good, but does kind of chastise her at the same time, saying, you need to start leaving Francis alone. He's accepted his lot in life, that he's going to live and die in High Place, which is the name of the Doyle's home. And you might be giving him ideas that aren't quite there, which is strange because at no point in time has Naomi actually been doing that. Is this something that Florence has just been inferring? We don't know. But again, it starts to set up this whole dynamic where once again, Florence has another reason to not like Naomi. That night, Naomi goes to bed, thinking she's going to go to town the next day and everything will be fine. But this night, she has another one of these really wicked, crazy dreams. And these are now becoming more frequent and they are becoming more vivid. In this one, she's now dreaming of Ruth. Remember, Ruth is the individual that Martha mentioned went a little sideways and shot up her entire family. That's not a good thing. And in this case, you're seeing almost a recreation of this, where Ruth opens a door and leans in with a rifle and shoots a Howard. But the Howard that's envisioned there is this bloated, tumorous, sort of just a disgusting depiction of a thing. And as she does shoot this individual, she then turns around and makes it very clear to Naomi in the dream, I'm not sorry. And that I'm not sorry thing continues to come up with Ruth regularly as we envision her going forward in these dreams, because she does start to make more and more appearances. The dream is interrupted, though, by that same individual that Naomi saw the first night when she got scared. This female figure that has a glowing face that tries to scream but doesn't scream. In this case, that individual is suddenly running at her and she's kind of scared, and she finds herself suddenly woken up, and she's on the stairwell now in the main part of the house with Virgil standing there. And he explains that she was sleepwalking, that he was following her to make sure that she didn't get hurt, but she felt that he felt it was time to actually interject and get her up and running so that she could stop wandering around the house, because she probably could get herself hurt. And there's an odd dynamic and an odd conversation here. I keep commenting on the fact that the dynamic and the conversation between Virgil and Naomi are shifting more and more. And in this case, they are shifting more and more. It shifts more to the point where, again, this tension is building up between the two of them, where we really don't know what to make of this at this point in time. She does go back to her room, though, and does go off to sleep, and that's the end of it. And she goes to bed thinking, I'm going to get up tomorrow and head into town. The next day, Naomi gets up, and she does head into town with Francis. Francis, recognizing that he's supposed to play the chaperone role, but he does recognize, I'm not going to do that. He drops her off and says, I'll meet you back here in a couple hours in the town square, and she's left to her own devices. She first goes off to see Marta. Now, Marta is the individual who's making the medicine that she was supposed to get for Catalina. The medicine is, in fact, ready, and she does get it. But while they're there, she has another conversation with Marta about what's going on in the house. And Marta starts to give her a little bit more of the backstory. And she does mention, yeah, there was that first epidemic. But, it was around the time of the second wedding. Now, this is the wedding that took place in 1895, which was to Alice, not Agnes, that things got worse. And what happened was that around that point in time, the workers were becoming, more restless. The reason why they were becoming more restless was because, up until that point in time, they'd been getting something called a partido. Now, a partido we'll cover later, but that this is when the Doyles decided they would stop doing that. And as a result of that, the workers started to get a little more active. And there was an individual that first popped out who was named Aurelio, and Aurelio was an individual who was getting the workers together and making them move on and actually, push their rights more towards the Doyles. And unfortunately, Aurelio died of natural causes, or at least that's what people say. But it was Aurelio's nephew, what is his name? Hold on, we'll look it over. Benito, who came into the picture. And Benito started to organize the workers even more and was pushing back against the Doyles. And Ruth, being the daughter of Howard, was in love with Benito. Benito was in love with Ruth. And when Howard found out, he darn near killed her. It didn't go well, and Benito just disappeared. It was shortly thereafter that it was announced that Ruth would be marrying Michael, who we'll remember is her cousin, and who was the son of Leland, Howard's brother. And it was only around this point in time when Benito just completely disappeared that, quite frankly put, Ruth just said, nah, I've had enough. And she drugged the family and then went on her killing spree. And that's the information that Marta gives her, that gives her a little bit more detail. But an interesting thing that does come from the conversation with Marta. You remember the doctor earlier had inferred that there were mass graves that the Mexican workers were buried in. Well, Marta actually stands up and says, no, that's actually not the case. No, Mexicans were buried there without markers who didn't have families, but those who did were brought down here and were buried in the village. So that's not just from the first round of the epidemic. That's from the rounds going forward. Because you'll remember, the doctor mentioned that these epidemics seemed to go away, everything was fine for a couple of years, and then they'd come back. Really gives you a lot more information into what happened with the whole Ruth thing here. And you get a sense of the civil unrest and let's just call it the power that the Doyles had at one point in time, and how that's now completely gone. After she's done her conversation with Marta, Naomi then goes off to see the town doctor again. Now bear in mind, the town doctor has not had really much assistance that he could provide other than to say, yeah, she needs mental help. And he once again says the same thing. She clearly needs mental help. Look at the words that are coming out of her mouth. While he's there, though, he notices that she's got this rash on her wrist. Now, the rash that's on her wrist is in the exact same spot that Virgil had interrupted her sleepwalking in her nightmare with the night before. And Naomi puts two and two together that this is the same location. But the doctor says, that's kind of weird. It looks like you've run into a contact with a particular plant. And the plant is called, I'm going to read this here, and again, I'm not going to try to pronounce this, M-U-J-E-R, which I'm guessing would be mujer. I could be entirely wrong, but that's my guess as to how that would be pronounced. But this is something that's weird because it doesn't grow in these parts. Anyways, he wraps it up and puts some tincture on it and says, okay, off you go. Now, Catalina is waiting patiently for this present of this medicine, right? We know this. Naomi has succeeded in getting this medicine. And Naomi's pretty excited about this, and it's around midday. So in her time seeing Catalina that day, she is not wasting any time. She wants to give Catalina some good news. They decide they're going to play cards, and she pulls out the medicine and says, hey, look what I've got for you. And this is where, well, things go really, really wrong. But I'm not going to spoil it. Hold on, let me just start reading through the segments here. So Catalina starts off with this. Dearest, thank you, Catalina said, pulling her into an embrace. I should know you would never abandon me. I thought monsters and ghosts were found in books, but they're real, you know. Once again, we're coming back to this, and you kind of wonder, okay, is this medicine that she's getting here something that's going to help us with the psychosis here, or is this something that's actually more? Bear in mind, she's been pretty clear this is all about the cemetery. Bear in mind all the weird things that Naomi's hearing. But this is where things are going to start going pretty quickly, so we got to start popping forward here. All right, so then she starts taking spoonfuls of this stuff, and she actually manages to pound back 4 spoonfuls of this thing before Naomi even stops and says, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's get into the action. Catalina slid a hand across the deck. Then she stopped. She lifted her hand, and her fingers remained hovering above the pack of cards, as if she'd been frozen in place. Her hazel eyes were open, wide, and her mouth was closed tight. She looked so strange, like a woman who'd gone into a trance. Naomi frowned. Catalina, are you unwell? Do you want to sit down? She asked. Catalina did not reply. Naomi gently grabbed her by the arm and attempted to maneuver her towards the bed. Catalina wouldn't move. Her fingers curled into a fist, and she continued to stare forward, those large eyes of hers looking wild. Naomi might as well have attempted to shove an elephant. It was impossible to get her to budge, not a single inch. Catalina, Naomi said, why don't? And then there was a loud crack. Dear God, Naomi thought it might have been a joint cracking, and Catalina began to shiver. She shivered from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. One sweeping, rippling motion. Then the shiver became more frenzied, and she was convulsing. Convulsing. Convulsing, there's a word there. She was pressing her hand against her stomach and shaking her head, and the most vicious scream escaped her lungs. Ooh. Hold on, we got to put something here. Don't lose this page. Okay, that's kind of important. Now, there's a couple key things that have come out of that thing. So she stood incredibly still after she took her medicine. It took her a couple seconds after the medicine had hit because they were going to be playing cards, right? And suddenly she freezes. But then she starts shaking. She starts convulsing. Now remember the symptoms of the epidemic. Now, is this history repeating itself? We honestly don't know. But unfortunately, things get even worse. All sorts of hell breaks out at this point in time. People come barging into the room. Naomi is rushed out of the room. Effectively, she's seen as an outsider at this point in time and some sort of cause of this problem. Now, I could kind of see that. Bear in mind, take this with a grain of salt. She's rushed out. Dr. Cummins is rushed in. And after a whole bunch of pounding on the door where she's just promptly ignored and gets no response, she is confronted by, we'll call it the whole family at this point in time. Florence, Dr. Cummins, everybody's there, and they're pulling out this tincture, this little bottle, and they're yelling at her saying, what did you give her? This is an opium tincture. This is incredibly ill-advised. You could have killed her. Virgil is involved at this point in time and says, I want to speak to Naomi alone. Now, this guilt trip has already been put on pretty heavy by the doctor and by Florence, and now Virgil lays it on even thicker. You could have made me a widow tonight, and makes her promise not to give Catalina anything, no more medicine without him knowing about it first. And she has to swear she's going to do it. And this is really a beautiful piece of psychological play here, because you say to yourself, are they actually this concerned or not? And this is where you as the reader are starting to ask this question, because there's so much suspicious activity going on here. You're wondering. And you're also saying, hold on, she had an opium thing? That's what Marta gave her? Opium? Really? That's okay. That seems a little harsh. And would opium cause? Again, all questions I don't know, but clearly somebody does. Dr. Cummins must, so I guess it kind of makes sense. The next day, Naomi's back in the cemetery, and she's really just trying to figure out what's happened here. She's trying to reconcile and deal with the guilt that's in front of her. She again sees the statue of Agnes, wondering why there isn't one for Alice. And Frances arrives, and Frances is trying to, really trying to alleviate her stress. And he explains to her, this isn't the first time this happens. And this is where we start to see Francis pull more and more into the role of really being her ally within the house. And he starts to spill the beans. But you really got to start digging between the lines to pull out exactly what he's saying here. He says, she's not happy here. She's already done this once. This isn't the first time. And Naomi is like, she's not suicidal. What's going on here? And Francis is like, no, she's not happy here and you should take her away. And Naomi says, well, I can't because your mother's got her under lock and key and nobody's going to let me do anything at this point in time. Plus, I can't take her away because then I'll fail in my mission and I won't get to go and do my master's. And there's all sorts of noise going around this. But she does say one thing. She says, okay, listen, I do need to go back into the city. And he's all like, whoa. Are you out of your mind here? Like, let's think our way through. It's like, I need to know what was in that medicine. I need this peace of mind. And I can understand that as well. After the huge amount of guilt that's been dumped on her by the whole family. She already feels like an invader in their home. Now she almost caused her own cousin's death. I could see wanting answers around that. That kind of makes sense. So now we have another night that's going between this conversation with Francis and when they're going to go into town the next day. And guess what? Naomi has another one of these horrendous nightmares. This one's odd. And I'm not going to give you too much on this one. What I am going to say is she's walking into the cemetery, and while she's there, she ends up witnessing, I guess, a pregnant woman giving birth. And the pregnant woman is murdered immediately after giving birth. The imagery in this one's strange. Like, I could dive down this rabbit hole, but I don't want to. It's just, one of the things that I'm going to say is, you'll remember some piece of information that we've already been given at this point in time. You'll remember that Howard's first wife, Agnes, died while she was pregnant. I'm not saying the two go hand in hand, but there's clearly some parallels here, and I'm just going to leave it to you to think about that one. Anyways, the next day, well, not even the next day, because what happens is, coming out of this dream, Naomi wakes up and she finds herself now standing at the bottom of the stairwells, and she's been sleepwalking again. Just weird. Now we get to the next day. So Francis does in fact drive her into town. They go to check on Marta, and Francis is following her around. Marta's not home. So she says, well, I guess we'll go see the doctor because, we're heading back that way anyways. And they actually bump into him on his way to opening the clinic. And while they're on the way and they're talking, she says, this thing happened. And, I was told by Dr. Cummins that this thing happened because, opium. And the doctor's like, really? Marta? Opium? I don't think that rings true. And the reason why he says it doesn't ring true is Marta only deals with local herbs. And poppies don't grow there. So where would she have gotten opium? And it's like, wait a minute. And Naomi's starting to think about this. She's like, that just doesn't seem right. So where would she get opium then? Or is Dr. Cummins now lying to me? Bearing in mind what Francis has said the day before, which is this isn't the first time this had happened. Kind of odd. And he also says to her, hey, how's that rash on your wrist going? She goes, oh, I totally forgot about it. They take off the bandage and it's completely healed. Which neither of them can explain because that wouldn't have happened. Just an odd thing. Now, when Naomi and Francis get back to the house, Naomi is summoned to Virgil's room where she's going to have a conversation. And here you have Virgil a little bit playing off of the guilt thing, a little bit playing off of the, I'm a concerned husband thing. And again, kind of really drawing the line with this tension that's between him and Naomi. They have a long conversation there where he's explaining, he's apologizing for his actions and his words the day before. But she did almost make him a widower, which is a concern to him. And he also makes a comment. He says, I noticed that you're spending a fair amount of more time with Francis than you are with your cousin. Now, that's kind of a strange comment, because you bear in mind, the household and Florence's rules are determining how much time she gets to spend with her own cousin. So it's not like she really has a choice in that matter. And it's not like she's been spending that much time with Francis. And it kind of makes you wonder, is there some hint of jealousy here going on with Virgil? And is this, again, playing into that weird sense of tension that comes between the conversations between Virgil and Naomi? It's an odd thing, but he does want to make sure that they're not at war and that they are working together as friends. And although Naomi's smart and doesn't particularly believe this, she's like, yeah, I'll give you the words you need to hear here. We're friends. Let's just move on. And here is also where we see Virgil start to divulge a little bit more and explains, I was married before her and I was married to Dr. Cummins' daughter, but, it was an arranged thing and we really didn't have a connection. And after 4 miscarriages, we divorced. And again, Naomi's getting more of a sense that she's learning more about Virgil. And you can see how Virgil's opening up a little bit here to try to sort of build bridges that just aren't there. But again, with all the suspicious activity in the house, you're wondering, why is this all happening? Well, I guess this evening Naomi gets a reprieve from the dreams because nothing is really dove into in great details. But the next day she's sitting down with Catalina because she's now having supervisors with Catalina with the maid hanging around in the background. And Catalina clearly is having a surface conversation with her, but sort of subtly infers to Naomi, no, I want you to get that book. You'll enjoy that book. And while the maid isn't looking, they find a strip of paper that's within there. And unfortunately, their time is cut short when Florence says, time's up, and Naomi's like, okay, well, that's fine. And she scurries away with the piece of paper in her hand, dying to get back to her room and read it. And when she gets there, she's thinking, okay, there's got to be a note written by Catalina, and it's going to tell me what's going on. But let's actually read what's in that note, because it's a little bit more than that. Okay, so it starts like this. I put these thoughts down on paper because it's the only way to remain firm in my resolve. Tomorrow I may lose courage, but these words should anchor me to the here and now, to the present moment. I hear their voices constantly, whispering. They glow at night. Perhaps that might be endurable. This place would be endurable, but not if not for him. Our Lord and Master, our God. An egg, split asunder, and a mighty serpent rising from it, expanding wide its jaws. It's kind of weird. What's with the snake thing? Our great legacy, spun in cartilage and blood and roots so very deep. God cannot die. That is what we've been told, what Mother believes. But Mother cannot protect me, cannot save any of us. It's up to me. Now, this is getting weird. Like, why would Catalina... Catalina's mother's dead. Anyways, whether this is sacrilege or simply murder or both, he beat me when he found out about Benito, but I swore then and there that I would never bear a child nor do his will. I believe firmly his death will be no sin. It is a release and my salvation. R. R, a single letter in the signature. Ruth. Can this truly be a page from Ruth's journal? Ooh. Ooh. Yes, it is. So after reading that little tidbit, Naomi's more confused than ever. Let's face it. Why would a letter of Ruth's be in Catalina's room? Why would Catalina wanted her to have read this note? Why is this so important? And what the heck is this Ruth person talking about where she's talking about sacrilege and Mother can't protect them? It just doesn't make sense. She's not putting the pieces together yet. So she goes to see Francis, and she goes to Francis's room and knocks on the door. And Francis is quite slow to the idea of bringing her in, but she says, listen, 5 minutes. Come on, let's go. And Francis is like, my mother would kill me if she found you here, but okay, fine. And they have a long conversation in the room where they talk about, well, his drawings and his art. And she does note how his room is materially inferior to Virgil's, and clearly he's not the favored child here. And this is when they suddenly hear Howard moan. And Francis lets a couple things slip at this point in time. And he's like, oh, it'd just be better if he would just die. Why won't he just die? And Naomi's listening to this going, it's your grandfather. That's great. He's a jerk, but where is this coming from? And in addition to that, Francis then talks about how Howard used to beat him as a child in an attempt to make him tougher, and how she, under no circumstances whatsoever, should ever trust Howard or Virgil. He doesn't list himself or his mother in that, but very clearly, Howard and Virgil, no, these are a no-go. Unfortunately, he has to go and he has to help his mother and the family deal with Howard, so she needs to go back to her room, and she ends up going back to her room to go to sleep. She's not able to, though. So she decides to run a bath. And while she's running a bath, this is where we see the first instance of her slipping out of consciousness during her waking hours. She's running her bath, and we don't really have a sense of whether she climbed into the bath first and then fell asleep, or whether she fell asleep and then envisioned herself getting into the bath. But as she gets into the bath, Virgil's suddenly there. And she's naked. And Virgil is basically imposing himself upon her. And I don't need to explain what imposing herself means to you. Needless to say, it's quite clear. And it's clear that this is something sexual. And it's something sexual that's actually moving beyond just the intonation of that, but actually moving into sexual activities. And this is not something Naomi is okay with. It's funny because part of her thinks that she is okay with it, and part of her thinks she isn't. And she suddenly finds herself in the same vision, being trapped in a coffin. And when that happens again, the open your eyes voice comes in. She awakes and she finds herself in Virgil's bedroom, soaking wet, in her nightgown, which is wide open. So literally naked under nightgown, soaking wet. And Virgil's like, why are you here? So once again, we have her being in Virgil's presence when she wakes up during one of these sleepwalking incidences. And this time she's actually in his room. There's a lot of suggestive language at this point in time between Virgil and Naomi. A little bit on Virgil's side to make it kind of clear that he's completely aware that he knows what Naomi was just dreaming about. And at the same time, almost hitting on her, at the same time showing some sort of weird power over. It's really weird. This dynamic is becoming more and more tense between the two of them. After some rather short and terse words are said, Naomi does just grab the oil lantern out of his hand and storm back to her room, where she finds that the bathwater is cold, the steam is dissipated, and she just pulls the plug and drains the tub. So how long that was? I don't know. So the next day after that weird bathtub thing, she's in her room and she's spending most of her day alone in her room because, well, why would you want to go out? That's kind of a weird thing. Anyways, as she's in her room, she's trying to read this witchcraft book again that she brought with her. And she slips again into a dream sequence during her waking hours. Now, this is 2 times in 2 days. So if you start to think about this now, these incidences of these dream sequences are becoming more and more powerful and more frequent the longer that she's staying inside this house. This time she's reading and she suddenly sees a mold thing going on the wall. And she acts really strange around it and a really weird response. So I'm just going to read it because I don't think I'll do it justice by trying to make this really quick. So let's just jump into it. Naomi clapped the book shut and looked away, her eyes landing on the corner of the room where the rose-colored wallpaper was stained black by mold. And she looked at it. The mold moved. Christ, what kind of optical illusion is that? She sat on the bed and gripped the covers with one hand while the other hand lit her cigarette. Slowly she stood up and approached the wall, unblinking. The shifting mold was mesmerizing. It rearranged itself into widely eclectic patterns that reminded her of a kaleidoscope, shifting and changing. Instead of bits of glass reflected by mirrors, it was an organic madness that propelled the mold into a dizzy twists and turns, creating swirls and garlands, dissolving, then re-emerging. There was color to it, too. At first glance, it appeared black and gray. Yet the longer Naomi looked at the mold, the more it became obvious there was a golden sheen to certain sections of it. Now remember, golden is what we've seen reflected in Virgil's eyes when he was a little bit excited. Bear that in mind. Golden, yellow, and amber, dulling or intensifying as the patterns remade themselves into a new combination of staggering, symmetrical beauty. She reached a hand as if to touch the section of the wall that was dirtied by the mold. The mold moved again, away from her, skittish. Then it seemed to change its mind. It pulsated as if it was bubbling up like a tar, and it crooked a long, thin finger, beckoning her. Okay, like a beckoning finger. Okay, I got it. There was 1,000 bees hiding in the wall, and she heard them buzzing as she pressed forward drowsily, intending to slide her lips against the mold. She'd run her hands across the shimmering gold patterns, and they would smell of earth and green, of rain, and then they would speak 1,000 secrets. The mold beat a rhythm of her heart, and they beat as one, and her lips parted. I guess she's going to try to eat it. The forgotten cigarette, still in her possession, burned Naomi's skin, and she let go of it with a yelp. She quickly bent down and picked up the cigarette, tossing it into her makeshift after her. She turned around to look at the mold, and it was absolutely still. The wall looked like old, dirty wallpaper and had not changed, not even a bit. So that's weird, right? Like, the idea of I'm going to eat this mold thing on the wall and it's going to tell me 1,000 secrets. And the bees buzzing. And the bees buzzing is a theme that I've been kind of cutting out here because it pops up all the time, but I still don't entirely grasp where it fits. So we're just going to ignore that for now until we actually figure it out. Well, when she comes to, she suddenly realizes that everybody in the household is now descending upon her room and are barging in because apparently she's been yelling. She's like, I haven't been yelling. They're like, no, you have been yelling. And she's like, can you all just leave me alone? Like, I have not been yelling. And this is where she now really has a sense. This is not a me thing. No. This is an everybody else thing. I do not belong here. This is not good. And Virgil's kind of arguing with her at this point in time. And she says, no, I want to see Catalina right now. Because she's trying to shift gears away from her in her room yelling. And they say fine. She goes to see Catalina, and Catalina is behaving completely fine, like she's not crazy, without a single crack in her armor. And she really doesn't understand why Naomi is visiting her. Virgil starts to downplay the whole vision that she's had, saying that she's tired. She was up last night, and that she's really just dreaming these things. And this is where Naomi has now just had enough. And this could also be where perhaps she's finally listening to Francis, and she should just leave. And she says, no, I'm leaving. I have had enough. That was the last straw for me. There's clearly something the matter with this house. And they say, that's no problem. You can leave. We'll do it tomorrow. But tonight we're going to have a big party to celebrate you being here, and it'll be fantastic. That's weird, right? Like, you're going to have a big... It's not just me. Like, we're going to have a big party. I don't know. It was a strange thing, but this is what they've decided to do. And I'll tell you honestly, it's this dinner party where suddenly things turn away from the tone stuff that we've been reading and suddenly become very much physical stuff. And we suddenly start to see a reconciliation of the metaphysical and the physical aspects of this story. So to start off the cacophony of what I'm going to call the culmination of the action here, the dinner occurs with everybody standing around the table except for Howard. Howard is absent, notably absent. And while they're having a conversation, the veil of the thinly guarded words is being stripped away because they recognize that Naomi's leaving. And they're very blunt about this. Oh, we're going to be reopening the mine after you leave. Oh, you didn't have any money for that. Oh, it's okay because Catalina decided to invest in the family, which is exactly what Naomi's father was kind of suspecting all along. They were just using her for money. And Naomi's just listening to all this going, this is utter garbage. When she's told, oh no, you have to go see Howard before you leave. And she's like, fine, I'll go do this. Well, she's taken upstairs to Howard's room, and it's while she's there that she's violently attacked. And this is the beginning of the end. She's violently attacked, and Howard is lying naked, covered with putrefaction and tumors, and just disgusting. The description is just, oh, it's full-blown yuck. And she's being forced over and pushed down into Howard by Florence and Virgil, who are pushing her towards him. Howard reaches up and grabs her head and literally puts his lips on her lips and sticks his tongue in her mouth. And then she has a memory of saliva running down her throat. And she knows she has to get up and get away. She's fighting back as hard as she can, but she cannot. And she suddenly finds herself losing consciousness and slipping into a dream sequence. Yet another dream sequence. But this one is the one that suddenly opens all of our eyes. So in this dream sequence, it's in a different setting. She finds herself in a cave. She recognizes the caves in Mexico somehow, but she also recognizes that this is a long time ago. And this is not just a dream. This is a memory. So what she's now seeing is Howard, a younger version of Howard, but even though he's younger, he still looks like an old man. And he's sick, like really sick. And he's been brought here, and she has a sense that he's been brought here as a sick individual because he's tried everything else and he cannot get better. This small tribe of outcasts are living in this cave where they worship something that they view as a god, and they have a priest, and they're a tiny clan. And Howard needs to ingratiate himself to them so that they'll accept him and allow him to potentially try the medicine that they worship as a god. There's an altar that's covered in bones as well as this fluid. And there's a depiction here that he's clearly trying to use a connection with a local woman as one of them, potentially as a bride, to buy his way in to this group of people, as well as the silver that he's bringing. Remember, he's a silver guy. But again, you also have a sense from Naomi that this is old. Like, she's thinking he looks like this is wearing clothes from hundreds of years ago. This is not relatively recent. At the end of the day, she does have a sense that Howard succeeds in ingratiating himself to this group of people. He gets a medicine, and then she finds that he's suddenly better, like materially better. And this local woman is now pregnant with his child, but she also can read the mind of Howard, Howard knowing that the reason why the medicine works for him is in his blood. It's something particular to him. And he needs to be able to keep this within his blood so that he can continue to be healed and potentially continue his life. And to do this, he has to do a couple things. Well, he needs to, A, get rid of this priest that's controlling the use of this medicine and take it over himself, which he does. He murders the priest. B, get rid of this bride and this child, because obviously these two are going to do no good, so obviously he's going to murder them. And then he knows that it's in his blood that the strength really comes from. And he remembers that he has two sisters back in England. That's right, I just said sisters, not cousin. Agnes and Alice. These weren't cousins he married. These were his sisters that he married. Yeah. And this is how he's keeping everything with his own bloodline. And this is how this whole thing started. It's got to do with some sort of medicine, and it's got to do with something with his blood. So this dream really does start to break down the metaphysical aspect of what's been going on here, as well as the physical aspect of what's been going on here. And this is where suddenly we're no longer playing with tone, we're actually playing with absolutes. And it's interesting because within the dream, it ends with Naomi clearly having a sense that she's being completely taken over by the mushroom, and then she wakes up. And she awakens in the room, and Francis is there. Now, bear in mind, she's probably going to be a little angry with Francis, because Francis clearly makes it known that he's known what's going on all along. And he does say to her that I have been trying to tell you this stuff if you would just listen, but you weren't willing to listen. And Francis explains that Howard found this fungus hundreds of years ago. In fact, 300 years ago. And that it extends its human life, and it cures diseases, and it does all the stuff that it needs to do. And that Catalina came to the house, and she was exposed to it, and the dreams that she's been having are exactly what Catalina's been experiencing as well, which is their access to what they call the gloom, which is this consciousness that lives inside the fungus. And it's a really interesting thing because it allows the Doyles, who have this strong bloodline that's what we're going to call copacetic with the fungus, to control it as much as they do. And the fact that it's in the air in the house and the fact that she's been in the house is why she's been having more and more dreams and visions and why it's been impacting her more and more. Now, bear in mind, she's only been there for a week, right? So imagine how bad this has been for Catalina at this point in time, who's been there for months. Like, this cannot be a good thing. Also, he drops a bombshell as well. He says that the fungus usually does one of two things. Either works with somebody or it kills them. And this is where you get a sense of why all the English workers were killed and why you get a sense of why all the Mexican workers were killed. It's because really the fungus just didn't work with them, which is kind of an interesting thing. But with the 300 years, clearly this is something where Howard is trying to continue his life, and why it's been Howard doing this all along is because every generation or so, he just takes his consciousness and dumps it into one of his own descendants. And the reason and the ability that they've had to do this is the fact that they're constantly marrying within their own family and inbreeding down to purify this blood source, which kind of talks to why Howard was so fixated with the conversation about eugenics as well, and potentially strengthening or weakening bloodlines. It all comes together in a very weird and creepy way. But this also draws back into the physical events that have been observed as well. So you start to see more conversation about the workers in the mines and how they were exposed to the fungus. You also hear about how Howard was able to control the workers in the mines basically by using the fungus and his control over the fungus itself. And those that did survive, but those that didn't. You also hear about the fact that it's when Ruth shot Howard and injured him as badly as she did that he suddenly lost control of the workers, lost control of the mine. And this is what led to their downfall. So Ruth really was successful in her actions to take out the control of this family. But she didn't finish the job and completely take out the family. And Naomi says, well, I'm going to leave. And Francis is clear. It's like, no, you physically can't. You could try. The fungus is going to stop you. And at one point in time, she does try to run off. And the fungus literally does cut down her windpipe. And she's stopped and carried back into the house. Not in this conversation, but in subsequent events. He also gets told that Catalina is continuing to fight the fungus, and this is why she's suffering as much as she is. It's really an odd tie-in here to where you're seeing, okay, it's not actually a ghost thing after all. It's almost like a biological weapon, and it's just creepy. So we switched from ghosty thing to almost like monster thing. I'm starting to see where the horror is coming into this story. And really, if you want to talk about monsters, I think it all becomes perfectly clear in the next dream sequence that we have, which we now know is actually the gloom or the fungus communicating directly with Naomi. And in this one, yeah. So we're going to skip a little bit here, but what happens is Naomi ends up seeing another pregnant woman giving birth. And in this case, the newborn, when it's brought out, is ripped up and eaten by everybody that's standing around. So we're eating newborns now. Yeah. You know, and the interesting aspect of this is also where you see that this is actually Agnes. So the initial vision that we had was correct. But we also find out that Howard needed to give the fungus a brain to control it. And the brain that he gave it was the living Agnes. So Agnes was not killed immediately after giving birth, as that first vision showed her. Agnes was wrapped up in a cloth and thrown alive into the pit where the fungus lives so that it could grow over her and consume her. Which also starts to give you more and more of a sense that perhaps this vision that she's been having in the dreams of this lady with the glowing face that screams may actually be Agnes after all. Ugh. Also explains why there's a statue out in the middle of the cemetery that says Mother, because apparently by consuming this flesh, and again, this all comes back to that whole the word shall become flesh quote, it really starts to take on a really eerie and creepy and monstrous tone as we now start to see the level of horror that is within Mexican Gothic. So the next day what happens here, because bear in mind, Naomi's pretty weakened by this, we'll call it an infection or a spore infection at this point in time, is she finds herself waking up and both Florence or Virgil in the room. And they've decided that she needs to take a bath. Now, bear in mind, we've already had a Virgil bath sequence here. And this rapidly turns into a repeat of this. And the demands are now put forward onto Naomi as to what's going to happen next. Really, this starts to get creepy because Virgil's really coming on to her and holding her down in the bathtub. And you can kind of get a sense that this whole dream sequence thing is going to kind of repeat itself. And Naomi's not really in for this, but at the same time, you're now wondering, is the part of her that's in for this actually just Virgil or Howard controlling the fungus in her brain? We don't know. What saves her is actually Francis, who arrives and says, no, you leave her alone. And he notes that Dr. Cummins is there. Dr. Cummins comes in and checks on her and says, you're dehydrated, you need to eat. And it's so funny because you've got this guy that's basically acting like, what's the guy who works for Dracula? What the heck is that guy's name? It goes with an R. Oh, for crying out loud, there's a really good movie about this too. I like Dracula. I should know this off the top of my head. Anyways, he's literally acting like the human thing that's going out there and taking care of the activities for the monster that's in the story. Renfield. Yes, I knew I would get it. Oh, man. Old man brain kicking in hard today. Anyways, so Naomi confronts him and says, hold on, why are you taking care of this family's matters in the city? What are you doing here? Why? And then she even goes further and she says, wait a minute, I'm putting two and two together here. Your daughter was married to Virgil first and had 4 miscarriages. Virgil said they divorced, but nobody's ever allowed to leave. They killed her, didn't they? You were okay with that. And Dr. Cummins doesn't say anything and just shuts up and leaves. And yeah, you really do get a sense this is bad. Francis arrives because he's brought food, and Dr. Cummins has been very clear that she does need to eat. She doesn't want to eat, but Francis now switches into Spanish, which nobody else in the family understands, and starts talking to her and says, no, the food is heavily poisoned and drugged. What you want to eat are the things that I point out to you. Just eat these because you need your medicine. And he also pulls out the tincture, that very quote-unquote opium-based tincture, which wasn't opium-based, and explains that he was told to get rid of it, but he didn't after Catalina had her fit. And he held on to it. So clearly the guy's been thinking. And he says to her, this actually weakens the fungus's hold on you. But you can't take a lot of it. You have to take a little bit at a time. Taking too much is exactly what just happened. So we'll start weakening this when you and Catalina, and then we'll get 2 of you out of here. And she's like, oh, okay. But I have to come up with a plan. We got to do all sorts of things to make this happen. So you got to slowly work with me here as we try to get this happen. But in the meantime, you need to just play along with things. Howard is really sick and he's dying. Just continue to go along with what they say we're doing, and when the time is right, we will get out of here. And that's kind of how we leave this off. And this is kind of also how we see the merge and the correction. Not the correction necessarily, but really the bringing in of this metaphysical sort of monster and the end of this whole specter of ghosts and what have you. And we've now turned it directly into something physical that's going to be dealt with in the physical world that Naomi lives within. So with all the mystical, metaphysical stuff out of the way, we now change the story from being very much one of tone and subtlety to actual action. So this is where we're dropping quotes now, and we're just going to run right through the action of what happens here. And really, you've got a couple parties at play here, and a couple different interests that are all not necessarily working in the same direction. So you have Francis, Naomi, and Catalina, where 2 of them are taking the tincture to make themselves somewhat immune to the fungus and the gloom. But this has to happen over time. Now bear in mind what has to happen here is they've decided that what Naomi's going to do is write a letter back to her father saying she's staying till Christmas. And during the time while she's staying till Christmas, she's going to marry Francis. And this is all going to explain why she's never going to leave the house now, because she's going to marry Francis. And the interesting aspect of this is the sort of predatory sexual energy that Virgil has had towards Naomi up until this point in time now seems to have to get parked, because now Naomi clearly is the fiancée of Francis. And this is something that Howard has dictated. So it kind of buys them a little bit of, let's just call it breathing room. During the time where the tincture is happening, time is passing, and the Doyles are preparing for a ceremony because they've decided there has to be a ceremony because Howard's big on ceremonies. They're going to have a wedding ceremony. They're going to get a dress. They're going to do lots of stuff. But in the meantime, Francis is still guiding Naomi on what food to eat so she's not getting further drugged. But Catalina's sort of dropping hints saying, well, you know what? He knows. The walls know. They know. And what Naomi sort of dismisses, much to her peril, is the fact that the walls do know and Howard does know. So as we get closer and closer to the wedding date, even though they think everything's going according to plan, and Naomi's been taking her time to actually communicate more with Ruth in the gloom and learn more about why she did what she did and what her actions were, you actually find out that Howard has just been waiting the whole time. Francis gets locked in his room the day of the wedding and gets separated, so Naomi doesn't have access to her. When Naomi finally sees Catalina that day, Catalina is somewhat catatonic, and she's been redosed. And she's trying to get her to get out, but she's not really responding. But before we get there, Naomi's already had a bit of a scuffle. Let's just call it that. You see, while she was trying on her wedding dress, Virgil decided he'd had enough of waiting. He decided, okay, I'm just going to have you right now. And Naomi is not having any part of this and does manage to actually knock him unconscious while she's defending herself. And she actually has a razor that Francis had given her so she would have a sense of safety. And she's thinking about slitting his throat at the time, but doesn't. And that's when she runs off, not knowing where Francis is because he's locked up, and runs into Catalina, who's in this somewhat stupid or redosed state. While she's trying to drag Catalina out, this is when one of the maids attacks, and she actually is violently attacked. At that point in time, she slashes the throat of the maid, or at least the body of the maid, who's mind controlled by Howard, and the maid dies. Florence manages to bring them all together and brings them up to Howard's room for the ceremony at this point in time, because they got to move this forward. And as they go into Howard's room, once again, giant bloated putrefaction that is Howard. Dr. Cummins is there literally cutting boils away from his mouth so that he can breathe, which is just, whoa, disgusting. And Florence is pointing a gun at them and holding them at gunpoint. Francis comes racing in, or has been there because he raced in during the whole time with the fight with the maid, because he had to break out of his own room. And he's now being put under a spell by Howard as they go through this ceremony. And it's interesting because Naomi's trying to stop this but can't do anything. She's being held at gunpoint while she's basically seeing Howard deciding he's going to take over Francis's mind right now. And this is not good for Naomi, and it's also not good for Francis. But what's interesting is everybody kind of forgot about Catalina. And she's standing there and she's holding on to that very razor that Naomi had all along. And she just starts hacking into Howard. And while she does that, Florence, who's mind controlled by Howard, Dr. Cummins is mind controlled by Howard, and Francis to a degree, all drop to the ground and start writhing in pain because Howard is now, I guess, dying. These are final attacks that are hitting him. And it is actually taking, and it's doing a good effect. So Naomi gets up, smacks Francis, wakes him up, and decides it's time to go. Florence decides that she's going to get up and do the gun thing again, and actually ends up breaking bones in Naomi's hand, which is just, the description is just, really, it gives you the creep. It does give you the creep when you read it. And unfortunately, through a tussle between Francis and Florence, Florence is killed. Naomi, Catalina, and Francis decide to make a break for it. They run basically through the pantry and down into a secret room, which leads them out into the family crypt. When they're on their way out through the family crypt, they run into not only Virgil, but also Agnes. The very Agnes that is the mind of the fungus. And through a giant conflagration of fire that ends everybody, the house burns down, the fungus burns down, and Catalina, Naomi, and Francis end up meandering down the street trying to get away. The book actually closes with the three of them in a friend of the doctor's residence as they're recovering. And Catalina and Naomi are discussing what they're going to tell the authorities when they arrive, because they got to have some sort of story. And it turns out that they were picked up on the way down by some villagers. And Francis has been in a coma for a couple days. They're waiting patiently for him to come out of it, and he does come out of it. And it's interesting at the end of this one that the sort of playful energy and the tension that Naomi had with Francis the whole time now turns into one of a legitimate love, and they're happy and they're together. And that's pretty much how the story closes. Yeah, I know. We wrapped that one up really quickly after we got out of the metaphysical stuff and got into the physical, but they really were just a really good action set of things that happened. And I don't want to go into too much details because really it's that whole lead up on this thing that really is where the strength of this story is. And it just screams so cool to you. And really, when you move away from the metaphysical and get into the physical, I can sit here and describe just actions all day, but let's just get to some more deep topics. Okay, so story part now done. Let's dive into the themes in this one. What themes really jump out of this story? Well, there's a bunch that come to mind. The first one is kind of a man versus nature sort of thing. And it's not really a man versus nature in the sense that, okay, it's man, or a Naomi in this case, fighting, like the wilderness. It's more of a case of the nature in this is the very house, the environment that she's surrounded with throughout the entire story. and stepping back and saying, well, how do I get around this overwhelming power that this house has? And at the end of the day, it's through collaboration with Frances and her own actions in bringing the tincture into the house that she manages to fight it off. But it's very much a man versus nature thing, and a common overarching theme that jumps out at me. Another one that comes out of this is really the sense of inevitability. And how do you deal with the inevitable, the knowledge of what's happening? Because when Naomi first gets to the house, and she's looking at Catalina, and she's looking at Catalina's real descent into madness, or what she's assumed is madness, there's clearly a sense that this is just inevitable. I can't do anything about this. Also, I can't get her to a local town where a psychiatrist could help. And I don't think I'm going to be able to do anything to stop this. And that's really a weird one. But again, it's how do you deal with the inevitable? How do you deal with things that you just can't fix? And the helplessness that comes with that. Also with age. I mean, look at the inevitability of Howard. The guy who wants to live forever through this horrendous and monstrous act that he's doing is doing this just because he knows the inevitability of death is there. And he just wants to survive. The other members of the family, I'm not going to give them much of a grain of salt here when it comes to feeling sorry for them. They're all a bit of a dip in their own way. Another thing that comes out of this one, though, and this is more of not so much of a theme, but a major interplay that happens throughout this story, which is the metaphysical, or I'm going to use metaphysical as the term here, versus the scientific. All the way up to the point in the story where suddenly she was attacked and the actions occurred, we were entirely getting a sense of this metaphysical, ghosty type haunting thing. Even Marta in the village says, I can't do anything that's going to protect you against a ghost. I actually gave her a bracelet with an evil eye on it. But that was it. It's all metaphysical. But then suddenly, in that one moment of the attack and the fungus and the explanation of the fungus, it went from that metaphysical to something entirely physical. And in that way, this story kind of blended your old school horror of your, I don't know, what we're going to call a vampire story into something more of a Frankenstein type story, where you've gone from something that's just overpowering and magical to something that's scientifically based, which was a really cool thing. I think the last thing that really jumps out in here, and I alluded to this a couple times in the story. Actually, this isn't the last one. It's the second last one. The second last one is, and this is a weaker one, but I think a big theme that comes out in the story that the author was clearly trying to drive down and drill into was the differences in values between an old school conservative English culture and the more upbeat 1950s culture that the character Naomi comes from. If you'll notice the interplay, and you'll notice just the butting of heads that was constantly occurring between Florence and Naomi, you really could see that Florence was pushing forward this, I'm the matriarch of this house, and this is what we do here, and you will listen. Whereas Naomi is sitting here as the young socialite on the other side saying, no, I will smoke my cigarettes, to hell with you. And I think that was a very clear point. But another thing, and this is the last one, I didn't think I was going to include this, but I've decided I'm going to, and this is why now this is the last one. The real weirdness here of the sexual tension and the gender roles. And this sexual tension thing here is something that came up time and time again between Naomi and Virgil. It's funny, it did not come up between Naomi and Frances, and it didn't even come up with Naomi and her initial suitor at the beginning of the movie, whose name was Hugo. It really came up with Virgil, an older, experienced male, and younger socialite Naomi. And how the two of them had this weird tension, which I believe was entirely pushed on her by Virgil and on her by the very fungus that was controlling minds within the house. But it was interesting that this was written in at such a point where you had this sexual tension thing that just continued to pop up time and time again in the dreams and even in the dialogue between Virgil and Naomi. Just an odd thing that, again, it popped up and I did feel it does deserve to be warranted to discuss and cover a little bit more. Well, those are the only themes, well, not only the themes, those are the major themes that I saw in this one that I wanted to walk through here. So let's jump into, well, what really spoke to me on this one, and, well, what was my reaction to this? Well, what in here really jumped out at me? Which one of these themes really hit home for me? You know, I think, I think I figured out the best way we're going to walk through this. What jumps out the best way for me in this is actually that very dynamic shift later in the story when you went from something metaphysical to something physical. I think when we jumped from a story where we were looking at ghosts and the walls, and all that sort of noise, and really setting the tone and what would have been a very good ghosty horror story. And I'm not saying that wasn't a good story. I'm saying it was really setting the tone for what really would have been a really good ghosty horror story. We immediately shifted gears to, oh no, it's not ghosts, it's actually mushrooms and science. And it's when we jumped from the one to the other, and how smoothly that occurred, and how this story gave you that shift, where suddenly the unknown, it's kind of like peeling back the veil of mysticism to reveal the science that's underneath it. When you saw that, the story then became so much more entertaining. And I'm not saying it wasn't entertaining to begin with, I'm saying it became so much more. Because it gave you both aspects of what you would typically see in, I guess, a good horror thing. You have that unknown ghosty mysticism, and then it suddenly turned into science. And here's the actual horror that's within the science. And now, granted, the baby eating thing, that was just darn gross. But I get it. I understand where we were going for it, because it really gave you the horror, and it gave you the picture that even science can just be horrific if you look at it through a certain light, or if you look at the actions they do, and they're just gross. All right, let's walk through some of the archaic language in this thing now, because we always do this when we do these podcasts. And as I mentioned in the intro, the majority of the archaic language we're going to run into today is really all from the fact that it's specific to Mexican culture in 1950, and the knowledge of their own history, which I don't have. So let's start walking through these things right off the bat. So the first thing that comes up is the colonia. Now, the colonia, C-O-L-O-N-I-A, and I'm looking over at my words over here to make sure I've typed them out correctly. And it's specifically used early in the story. It says, many formerly thriving mine sites that extracted silver and gold during the colonia interrupted their operations, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, well, what the heck is a colonia? So the colonia effectively is the period of colonial rule in Mexico that lasted roughly 300 years. And it went from 1521 all the way up to the Mexican formal Declaration of Independence in 1821. The War of Independence started in 1810, by the way. So that's the colonia. I guess colonial, so I guess it would make sense. Now, something else is referred to in here that also refers to with the Doyle's mine. It talks to when they came. And the sentence here is, later on, the English and French were welcomed during the tranquil oh my goodness, I'm going to have a hard time with this one. Porfiriato. I'm guessing that Porfiriato, there you go. Their pockets growing fat with mineral riches. So Porfiriato is actually a historic era that happened after Mexican independence. And it happened between 1876 up until 1910. And during that time, there's a General Porfirio Diaz, that took over the country and basically pushed things into a forced militarized order and progress and social order by force program. Again, this is coming from Wikipedia and a bunch of other sources. I haven't vetted it, but just for general context, that's what the Porfiriato is. Now, Rebozo. This is an interesting one. In it, in the story, Naomi is asked, oh, did you bring a sweater? She goes, well, I brought a rebozo. And later on, she finds out the rebozo doesn't quite do the job when you're talking about all the cold. So a rebozo is a traditional long Mexican shawl, which is hand-woven from cotton, wool, or silk. So I guess it's just something you wear over you. I wouldn't say it's a poncho, but a rebozo. There you go. Another one that came up on this that's an interesting term, and this is actually an individual's name. So in this, Naomi is somewhat flirting with Francis, trying to get him to help her out. And she says, you're like a character out of a Horacio Quiroga story. So Horacio Quiroga was a short story writer, poet, and playwright from Uruguay, who is considered to be the father of the Latin American short story. From what I can see that the majority of his stories that he wrote were based in jungle settings, with a common theme being man versus nature. Now, remember, one of the themes that we hit in this story, I said the first one that jumps out was really man versus nature. So that's kind of interesting. Another thing that he does is he portrays mental illness a lot, and he takes inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe when he does that. Kind of neat. And that actually might come back to us when we go to the next segment of this video. Okay, here's a cool one. The Partido. Okay, the miners expected the Partido. This is actually a really weird one because in the story it talks about the partito being something the miners expected, and when the Doyles discontinued it, it caused dissent. So this refers to a historic labor practice of giving miners in silver mines a portion of their wages in ore. Now, from what I could find online, this apparently led to exploitation, debt, and major strikes. But in this story, one of the things they say is that the fact that it was taken away caused strife with the miners. I'm not sure how those two things reconcile, but I'll move beyond that. Okay, the last one in here was the plant that I discussed earlier on, the one that gave Naomi her rash on her wrist. Malamuyere. We'll call it Malamuyere. The plant that she came into, okay, so, and the doctor said it almost looks like you came in contact with Malamuyere, and that doesn't grow here. So this is a common name for a stinging plant that grows in Mexico, Arizona, all sorts of places around there, with hairs. And apparently touching them can cause severe dermatitis. Oh, well, that's not good. Yeah, that's a bad thing. Yeah. So anyways, those are the archaic terms that came up out of this one. Not a lot, and as I say, most of them are very specific to Mexican culture and the whole culture around this story. Things that I just didn't know. Okay, so what did I think of this story overall? Let's wrap this one up with the last segment we always put into these podcasts. What did I think of this? Well, I actually really like this story. I tell you, when I came into the house, and as I mentioned earlier, I read the back of this, and I went, no, I'm not going to read this. This horrifies me. I put it on a shelf, and I ignored it. That was a mistake. This was a really cool story. This is nowhere near as horrific or terrifying as I thought it would be. And I got to tell you, I've read some terrifying things that have just full-on goose hairs up my arm, and just, stupid pigeons. Anyways, there are things that really scare me. This didn't, but I really liked the story, and I liked the playful use of this switch that the author did here. Silvia did a great job in this, keeping the tension and the tone just palpable for the entire front end of the book. And even when things change from something metaphysical into something physical, even though I quickly walked through that wrap up, it still kept the tone there. It still kept that level of, ooh, this is creepy and bad. It still held your attention. So I really did enjoy this. I thought this was a lot of fun. Now, additional books that you could read after reading this. Well, I tell you, it's funny. We fell our way into this one because I just picked it up and said, I'm going to read this. The parallels between this story and The Fall of the House of Usher, which we covered in episode 2 of this library podcast, are so palpable, it's ridiculous. You can't help but notice them, and they're screaming in your face. So if you like that, you probably want to read The House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's interesting that Silvia, in her own comments in the back of this book, actually references Edgar Allan Poe as being a major influence for her, as well as some of these other ones, which I'm going to get to next. I haven't really looked too much further into this, but I'll tell you, one of the things that Silvia covered in the back of this thing was how this was inspired by something called the New Gothic romance genre. Now, I've read classical Gothic horror. I have not read any sort of new Gothic romance or anything after that. Apparently there's a website that she links in here that gives you all sorts of definitions of how you can find and classify various Gothical horror or Gothic stories. So I would suggest you probably want to go down that road if you've enjoyed this. Now, she mentions the two biggest influences for her in this were two stories, and I'm going to actually get these right here. So actually, one's fairly old, by Charlotte Perkin Gilman. It's called The Yellow Wallpaper, and that was published in 1892. So you're talking like Edgar Allan Poe age on that. The next one she mentioned is actually a story that's written by the very person that I said is an archaic term, which is The Feather Pillow by Horatio Quiroga. And this one, it sounds like we lean more towards that one in here than we do the first one from what I've seen. Now, they also reference that if you're interested, that another Poe story that's called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward is the next one that does influence this story and speaks to some major themes in here. I might jump into that because I do have the collected Poe over there. But I think one of the things that I do want to touch that's within this very realm, though, is the fact that Silvia mentioned that she was heavily influenced by the New Gothic romance books that came out in the 1960s and 1970s, which I guess were when they were at their heyday. I'm going to look up some of those. Because I tell you, when I Googled it, I found a whole bunch that were 2024 and 2025 books. And those might actually just be follow-ups or books that are being published after this one's success. Could be the case. But I think I do want to read some of the older ones because it sounds like they might be rather interesting. Now, I know it sounds pretty weird for me, Tennessee Fats, to be saying I'm going to go read some new Gothic romance books, but I think I might. I think this is kind of showing me, hey, these are kind of fun. You might want to have fun reading these. Yeah, there's my list of all the subsequent reading that you might want to enjoy. And I would encourage you, if you are going to pick this book up, if you have skipped through my long, involved discussion of exactly what happens in this story, and you're saying, I've just gone to the end here, Tennessee Fats, I've read your summary or listened to your summary, and now I want to go buy the book, I would strongly encourage you to get a copy of the book that has all these fancy little throw-ins that my copy has. Because I got to tell you, the questions that they asked at the end of this one and all the additional add-ons, they do add value. Well, there you go. Everybody, that is the end of our Tennessee Fats Library podcast number 3. We've just walked through Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I am looking forward into jumping into the next story. I don't know what it's going to be. I'm looking at the library right now and I'm thinking, am I going to go down the road of reading that Poe piece? Or do I want to do something a little different? Maybe we'll dive into some Burroughs next.